datos de ADP. También hemos conocido, por cierto, el dato de los JOLTS, de las ofertas de empleo. Lo hemos conocido hace 15 minutitos aproximadamente. En este sentido, ¿qué hemos tenido? Bueno, pues que se esperaba una caída significativa de esas vacantes de empleo. No ha habido una caída tan grande. Al final, 8,86 millones es en lo que se queda esas vacantes de empleo. Esperábamos 8,80 millones y veníamos de 8,88 millones. Así que ha habido una bajada de 0,02 millones, si me apuran, cuando se esperaba una bajada de 0,08, es decir, 4 veces más de lo que finalmente ha sido. Bueno, pues seguimos escuchando de momento los comentarios que le están haciendo los políticos, los legisladores americanos a Jerome Powell. De momento, un poco sensaciones que están viendo de la economía estadounidense, sensaciones que tienen hacia dónde nos tenemos que dirigir, y enseguida va a hablar Powell. Como digo, discurso que ya se ha publicado. Aquí no va a estar el meollo del asunto, porque el meollo de este asunto del discurso ya lo conocemos. Aquí ya saben que al mercado le importa la novedad, la incertidumbre, lo que no sabemos. Claro, por eso siempre los datos se suelen comparar con el esperado, porque el dato es la novedad. Y la novedad es siempre en función de las expectativas que ya estaban incorporadas en el mercado. Las expectativas hoy, ¿dónde están? Pues claramente a la vista está de lo que se están moviendo los índices americanos, están optimistas de cara a este discurso de Powell, que no sea demasiado duro con respecto a la posibilidad de que las bajadas de tipos sean mucho más tarde de lo que está estimando el mercado, que ya saben que espera que lleguen en junio, más o menos, vamos, antes del verano prácticamente. Que no sea demasiado duro también con respecto a las subidas de los precios que hemos visto en estos últimos meses. Bueno, son muchas las cuestiones que puede poner Jerome Powell encima de la mesa en el día de hoy. Lo vemos ya aparecer en pantalla. Vamos a escucharlo.
To present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. The Federal Reserve remains squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. The economy has made considerable progress toward these objectives over the past year. While inflation remains above the FOMC's objective of 2%, it has eased substantially, and the slowing in inflation has occurred without a significant increase in unemployment. As the labor market tightness has eased and progress on inflation has continued, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals have been moving into better balance. Even so, the committee remains highly attentive to inflation risks and is acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. The FOMC is strongly committed to returning inflation to its 2% objective. Restoring price stability is essential to achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Economic activity expanded at a strong pace over the past year. For 2023 as a whole, gross domestic product increased 3.1%, bolstered by solid consumer demand and improving supply conditions. Activity in the housing sector was subdued over the past year, largely reflecting high mortgage rates. High interest rates also appear to have been weighing on business fixed investment. The labor market remains relatively tight.
Pues por el momento Powell, hablando de economía, dice que primero va a intentar elaborar un poco más sobre la situación económica y que enseguida va ya a proceder a hablar de política monetaria, que aquí es donde está lo importante del asunto, aunque ya saben que lo que dice ahora, que está leyendo ese discurso, ya lo conoce el mercado. Por lo tanto, aquí no va a haber novedades. Las novedades van a estar cuando Powell responda a las preguntas, que ya saben que los legisladores suelen dar en el clavo y Powell además se suele extender más que en una rueda de prensa. Bueno, de momento lo que está diciendo es que claramente siguen teniendo ese fuerte compromiso para devolver a la inflación al 2%, que la inflación sigue por encima de su objetivo, pero que ha bajado de manera sustancial, punto positivo también y optimista en esas declaraciones de Powell, y que además esa desinflación ha ocurrido sin que haya un aumento significativo en el paro. Dice que los riesgos ahora mismo se están moviendo en un balance, en un equilibrio mejor, en un equilibrio más optimista. Vamos a seguir escuchando a Powell.
Total personal consumption expenditures prices rose 2.4% over the 12 months ending in January. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.8%, a notable slowing from 2022 that was widespread across both goods and services prices. Long-term inflation expectations appear to have remained well anchored, as reflected by a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. After significantly tightening the stance of monetary policy since early 2022, the FOMC has maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25% to 5.5% since its meeting last July. We've also continued to shrink our balance sheet at a brisk pace and in a predictable manner. A restrictive stance of monetary policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle. If the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year. But the economic outlook is uncertain, and ongoing progress toward our 2% objective for inflation is not assured. Reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could result in a reversal of progress we've seen in inflation and ultimately require even tighter policy to get inflation back to 2%. At the same time, reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering any adjustments to the target range for the policy rate, we will carefully assess the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. The committee does not expect that it will be appropriate to reduce the target range until it has gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-run inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Powell.
Bueno, pues lo que ya sabíamos de momento, Powell leyendo su discurso ya preparado, ya publicado por parte de la Fed. ¿Y qué es lo importante que ha dicho aquí? Más bien en la última parte, cuando ha hablado de política monetaria. Dice, pensamos que nuestro nivel de tipos de interés ya está probablemente en el pico, por lo menos en este ciclo de subida de tipos de interés. Dice, creemos que va a ser probablemente apropiado devolver una normalidad a esta política monetaria este año, pero la economía o la situación económica sigue en un momento muy incierto, así lo ha dicho Powell. Dice, reducir esa restricción demasiado pronto o en demasiada cantidad, en una magnitud demasiado grande, podría causar un efecto contrario a lo que estamos buscando nosotros y podría acabar haciendo necesaria más restricción monetaria. Es decir, Powell, sin decirlo, ha dicho que bajar los tipos demasiado pronto podría hacer que volvieran a tener que subir los tipos de interés en algún momento. Ahora sí, esto también es importante. También ha hecho hincapié en la otra parte, hacer o bajar los tipos demasiado tarde o demasiado poco. Dice, esto puede acabar debilitando la economía. Responde de nuevo Powell a otra pregunta.
And those are the things we'll be looking at. I can go further if you'd like.
So at what point will the Fed be forced to cut rates? What does the data, what kind of data would you point to? And do you have any updates there?
What we've said is that the committee would like to see more data that confirm and make us more confident that inflation is moving sustainably down to 2%. We have some confidence of that. Inflation, headline inflation has moved down more than 3 full percentage points now to 2.4%, as I mentioned in my remarks. We want to see a little bit more data so that we can become confident and so that we can take that step of beginning to reduce policy rates. It's a very important step. We think because of the strength in the economy and the strength in the labor market and the progress we've made, we can approach that step carefully and thoughtfully and with greater confidence. And when we reach that confidence, the expectation is we will do so sometime this year. We can then begin dialing back the restriction on our policy.
Well, let's pivot to regulatory policy. Chair Powell, as you know, there have been serious concerns expressed on both sides of the aisle and across America and across industries about the Basel III endgame proposal that Vice Chair Michael Barr has proposed and that the Fed is taking up. The concern is on both process, meaning how the proposed rule was developed, analyzed, and released for comment, the general concern of a lack of economic
Curiosa la pregunta que le hacen a Powell. ¿En qué punto la Fed puede verse obligada a bajar los tipos de interés? ¿Qué tiene que ocurrir para que la Fed los baje, básicamente? Bueno, pues él dice, lo que hemos dicho desde el Comité de Mercado Abierto de la Reserva Federal es que nos gustaría ver más datos que confirmen que la inflación se está moviendo de manera consistente y sostenible hacia el 2%. Dice, tenemos alguna confianza de que eso está ocurriendo, pero queremos ver más datos para poder estar más confiados de que podemos bajar los tipos de interés. Dice, es un paso muy importante y deberíamos intentar enfocar este paso de manera cuidadosa. Dice, bajaremos los tipos en algún momento de este año. ¿Cuándo? Dependerá de que lleguen más datos. Así de claro lo ha dicho Powell, certeza absoluta de que los tipos van a bajar este año. El momento en el que llegue, de momento no se conoce, pero dice que hace falta más datos y que hace falta tener más confianza en esa bajada de la inflación. Sigue hablando Powell.
We're carefully analyzing them. We had asked for very specific, detailed, data-based comments, and I'm happy to say that we did get that. So we're just now reaching the stage where we can begin to make decisions about how to proceed. We really haven't made any decisions yet, but I think I can say a few things. First, we do hear the concerns, and I do expect that there will be broad and material changes to the proposal. I'll add that I'm confident that the final product will be one that does have broad support both at the Fed and in the broader world. As far as process is concerned, we're really not at the stage of making decisions about that. That's down the road at least a bit. I will say the question we get is reproposal, and I will say that we haven't made that decision, but if when we get to that point that turns out to be the appropriate thing, we won't hesitate to do it.
You won't rule that out. You would not rule that out at this stage of the game, reproposal.
Not at all. No, I think it's a very plausible option. It will depend on how things lie at the time when we reach that point.
Okay. And there's a lot of concern about the interplay between different parts of the rule. And if you change one, what does economic analysis look like for the new proposal? So it is good to hear that you'll be methodical and the Fed will do its traditional role of building consensus around the substantive changes. And that is your intention.
That is right. I said this would be a thoughtful, deliberative process. It's more important that we get this right than that we do it fast. We understand that. This is an important rulemaking, and it's going to have potential implications for the economy and the people we serve. We're going to take our time and do it right.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. The ranking member, Ms. Waters, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, I want to talk to you about housing, but before I get there, let me address the issue of mergers. Last week, I led a letter along with 15 committee Democrats to you as well as DOJ, OCC, and FDIC, expressing my strong concern about the lack of progress you have made in updating your bank merger review procedures. This is critical now that we just learned of another mega merger involving Capital One and Discover, which would create the 6th largest U.S. commercial bank with a major role in the credit card market. For far too long, experts have raised alarm that there is a rubber stamping process of bank mergers where virtually all applications are approved. All the while, unbridled market consolidation poses great risk to consumers and entrepreneurs. What is the status of your updates to the merger review process? And does the Fed plan to convene public hearings on the Capital One and Discover merger?
So I believe we're in regular contact with the Justice Department on what's going on with their review of merger practices. We're looking at that and considering. I think on the potential merger with that you mentioned, we haven't received an application, so there's really not much to say yet. It's early days. When we do get that application, though, we're going to evaluate that merger as always under the factors laid out under the law, and that's our commitment.
So you do believe that your bank merger procedures are ready to do the work that's necessary when you evaluate this possible merger?
I do.
And are you supportive of organizing community hearings on this merger?
I haven't talked about that with anybody. I will say this: we've done that in many large mergers, but that's not a conversation we've had yet. We literally don't even have an application for the merger yet.
Thank you. We'll stay in touch with you on that. So turning to the National Affordable Housing and Homelessness Crisis.
Bueno, pues por ahora están preguntándole a Powell por esa fusión entre Capital One y Discover, una fusión que va a convertirse en uno de los mayores bancos de Estados Unidos, dice, sobre todo en el negocio de las tarjetas de crédito. Y bueno, le han preguntado por esta fusión. Lo que ha dicho es que de momento, bueno, pues están en contacto regular con el Departamento de Justicia para revisar las prácticas de fusión que se están realizando entre empresas y han dicho que, bueno, simplemente ellos no han recibido ninguna aplicación de momento por parte de estas dos compañías para fusionarse. Bueno, ahora le está haciendo otra pregunta. En este caso, Miss Waters, vamos a ver cuál es el asunto sobre el que se le pregunta a Powell en este caso. Vamos a escucharlos.
Three components that we look at that make up the core PCE and index, and it has been coming down from its heights of a couple of years back. It's part of the story. I think the overall story is that goods price inflation has turned negative. Goods prices are actually coming down a bit. Housing services inflation, you can see from currently entered into leases that as leases turn over, the increases are going to be smaller. So in our forecast and in everyone's forecast, housing services inflation comes down.
It's been reported that the methodology used to assess housing costs as an indicator of inflation is imperfect. Namely, because it considers costs based on both new and old rent, including for owner-occupied housing on a month-to-month basis. This results in stale data since families' housing costs typically do not change unless they move or their lease is up for renewal. So to address these...
Powell dando algunos detalles también de cómo se está moviendo la inflación en Estados Unidos. Dice que de momento la inflación de los bienes se ha vuelto negativa, es decir, hay deflación. Y dice también que la inflación de los servicios de la vivienda también, aquí estamos viendo partes positivas porque dice que los alquileres están ya... las subidas de los alquileres están siendo menores poco a poco. Vamos a seguir escuchando la pregunta que le van a realizar a Powell.
So we're well aware of that, and we do incorporate it into our thinking. As I was starting to mention, that is the reason, the fact that market rents are moving up at a much slower pace is the reason why forecasts are for housing services inflation to come down, and that absolutely plays a role in our thinking.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The Vice Chair, Mr. Barr, is, I'm sorry.
Wrong Vice Chair.
Wrong Vice Chair. The gentleman from Arkansas, the Vice Chair of the full committee, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to welcome you, Chairman Powell, to the committee. We're glad to have you back and your expertise. And I want to pick up where Chairman McHenry left off on his conversation about Basel III Endgame. You made a good point saying you're not taking the whole concept of reproposal off the table as you review the analytics. And you all discuss the interactivity of that rule with other rules. So if you were to repropose the Basel III Endgame, would the Federal Reserve delay then the long-term debt proposal that's on the table? In other words, would you agree that the agency should not finalize this long-term debt proposal for bank holding companies until banks have a better understanding of what their capital obligations under Basel III Endgame might be?
So we haven't made the first decision yet, so it's hard, I couldn't say definitively. But yeah, that's a question we'd be asking ourselves: is what would be the implication for other rules, including the long-term debt?
Well, and is the Fed considering changes to the requirement for regional banks to issue long-term debt? Right now, it's stated to be issued at 6% of risk-weighted assets, in abundance of caution in case there needs to be a resolution. Obviously, we know the logic for it. But as I understand it, it's being required at both the holding company level and down at the bank level, and that seems redundant to me. Are you aware of that, and have you considered changing that in your discussions?
Yeah, so that's another area where the comment period ended a little while back, and so once again, we're in the process of evaluating the comments. There will be a thoughtful, deliberative process around that. We welcome comments on these kinds of things. They're very important implications for the banks that are affected. We want to understand the effects, make sure we understand them correctly so that we can evaluate what a final rule should look like.
Good. Let me turn to the monetary policy outlook. As the chairman noted, consumer prices are 17% higher for American households since President Biden was inaugurated back in January of 21. And yet, in spite of that 17% increase in cost, real wages have actually fallen 2% over that period. So there's no doubt that inflation is the biggest issue facing American households. And in my view, there's three principal causes. Certainly we had supply disruptions, but we've had unprecedented fiscal policy laxity. You described it in a recent interview as unsustainable. But we also think that the Federal Reserve, in my view, and many people on this committee commented, should have reduced accommodation after the pandemic sooner. One of the things coincident with that, which is what I want to talk to you about, is that the FOMC announced in August of 2020 this flexible average inflation targeting framework right in the middle of the pandemic, which many of us didn't understand why the Fed would take that decision then, but it would give you flexibility on the 2%, saying the Fed could allow inflation to rise above 2% and stay there above that level for some time because the Fed had such challenges in getting the price level to 2%. That was a major shift in the Fed's approach. Do you think, in retrospect of now what we've witnessed over the past 4 years, that that was a mistake in hindsight to change that framework, and is it under review?
So we said we would do a review on a 5-year basis, and that means we'll be starting that review toward the end of this year. So we really haven't started. I do think that the question you raised will be one of the questions we look at. But the bigger question really is that change in the approach was really based on the fact that we'd had very low interest rates and very low inflation for a long period of time. And policy was always very close to the effective lower bound, so there wasn't any firepower for central banks. And so it was a way to keep inflation expectations anchored at 2% and not have them slide down. Now we have entered a different period. The pandemic really may have changed that in a sustained way. We don't know that yet, but that's the big question we'll be asking ourselves is the effective lower bound to be thought of in a different way now? And if it were, that would have ramifications for our framework. But we haven't begun the review yet. It'll begin at the end of this year and probably end late the next year.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here. And I think I want to pick up a little bit right where we are. 2019, 2020, the entire world was under the unprecedented pandemic with COVID rate. Is that correct?
Yes.
At the time. And that changed a lot of things with reference, because not just for the United States, but for the entire world. And it affected the economies of countries just about on the planet. That's not also correct?
Yes.
And supply chains were disrupted. In fact, I can remember many Americans and people around the world could not get toilet paper.
Interesante pregunta la que le han hecho justo antes a Jerome Powell. Le han preguntado por ese cambio que realizó la Reserva Federal justo después de la pandemia, diciendo que cambiaba el objetivo de inflación y que no lo mantenía estrictamente en el 2%, sino alrededor del 2%, tanto por arriba como por abajo. Bueno, pues le han preguntado esto a Powell, si va a cambiar, si piensan o cuál es el motivo realmente detrás de ese cambio en el enfoque o el objetivo del Banco de la Reserva Federal. Dice, vamos a hacer una revisión de nuestro objetivo de cara a los próximos 5 años. Dice, todavía no hemos empezado a realizar esta revisión, pero lo vamos a hacer. Y dice que de alguna manera antes de la pandemia vivíamos en un mundo de una inflación muy, muy baja, pero que la pandemia esto lo cambió. Y que la pregunta real, la cuestión importante que tenemos que preguntarnos ahora mismo es si ese objetivo más amplio de en torno al 2% está funcionando de manera efectiva ahora mismo para anclar esas expectativas de tipos de interés. Dice que de todas maneras la revisión sobre ese objetivo de la Fed va a empezar ya el año que viene, así que habrá que esperar un poquito para conocer la opinión de la Fed en este sentido. Más preguntas para Powell, vamos a escucharlas.
So that they could get out of it, so that they could have a labor market that is strong, where the unemployment rate is near a 50-year low. And as you've stated, inflation is also now coming down faster than any place else on the planet, just about. Is that not correct?
I think that's right. Yeah.
And I think that you also recognize a mismatch between the strength of the economy, that's what we're talking about, in the field. And I think that Ranking Member Waters touched on one of those big issues of housing, of which is now, we're still trying to get that under control. And I think the Ranking Member has some ideas on how we can do that, and that may be something that you need to consider so that we can further get down the inflation rate. And the other would be the commodity markets, because the cost of food is too high in people. So that's something else that we need to get in control. Is that not correct?
Yes.
And let me just ask this. Can you say that there's a connection, for example, between conflicts in other areas of the world, like Russia's war against Ukraine and or the turmoil in the Middle East and the economic pressures that the United States feels? Does that not also go into the reason why the cost of commodities can be still higher? Is there a connection therein, Mr. Chairman?
Certainly the war in Ukraine caused commodity prices to move up sharply.
So could you tell you what is the, what would the connection lead you to believe that there is an urgent need for us, I would think, for, when we're running out of time, for us to do everything that is in our power in Congress to support Ukraine, so that we can make sure that and other strategic partners, that we can help the commodities market, and that would help lower the cost of some of the commodities, bringing food prices down, if we would just be able to pass certain things that's going to help Ukraine right here in the United States Congress. Is that correct?
Here's where it gets outside of our jurisdiction. So I wouldn't have an opinion on Ukraine funding.
But if we had more grain that was going through, it wasn't blocked by Russia, things of that nature, that generally just, says that helps bring the cost down. Cost is higher because of the disruption in the Black Sea that's happened because of this war. So that would help bring the cost down. That is not necessarily the policies just here in the United States, but that's the policy because of what's going on in Russia. And we need to make sure that we do something to prevent that if we really are serious about bringing inflation down. Is that not correct?
I think it's correct that a full supply of grain would help with commodity prices.
And so, instead of us playing politics with this and acting like it is your fault or anyone else's fault that we had to go and do what we did because of the...
Bueno, muy listo este legislador. Le está pidiendo a Powell que opine sobre esa ayuda de Estados Unidos a Ucrania de 60.000 millones que sigue bloqueada en el Congreso. Le está pidiendo de alguna manera que confirme que sin esa ayuda los precios de las commodities, entre otras, por ejemplo, el trigo, va a seguir subiendo. Bueno, pues Powell se niega un poco a responder a esto. De hecho, dice que él no va a opinar sobre la financiación que pueda dar Estados Unidos a Ucrania. Eso sí, le ha hecho preguntas para que de alguna manera se sobreentienda la opinión que tiene Powell. Por ejemplo, ¿es cierto que con un suministro total del grano de Ucrania al mundo esto podría controlar el precio del trigo? Efectivamente, Powell dice sí, es cierto, pero no responde, no está queriendo decir el presidente de la Fed que simplemente por una cuestión de que los precios no se disparen en el mercado de commodities, allá o Estados Unidos tenga que aprobar ese paquete de ayuda de 60.000 millones de dólares para Ucrania, que de momento sigue bloqueado en el Congreso porque los republicanos de la ala más dura se niegan a aprobarla. Más preguntas para Powell.
I very much appreciate your comments and responses to Chairman McHenry about the nature of the overall proposal. Congress wanted end users to be able to secure their hedges without posting margin to keep the derivatives markets affordable. But I've seen estimates that some of these types of transactions for end users could face 10 times the capital requirement. Chairman Powell, make me feel a little better. Ease my concerns here. Will you and the Fed work to fix this?
Let me start by saying I want to echo the fact that our commodity markets and our capital markets are a huge national asset, and we need them to be functioning well and with as little friction as possible. I now understand that what you're referring to is the things that were done to increase capital requirements for various kinds of derivative activities. And I'll just say that's an area we're aware of the concerns, and it's an area that we're taking a very close look at.
I appreciate that. I was a member of the Dodd-Frank Conference Committee where there was bipartisan support to not disadvantage end users, farmers, ranchers, small businesses. This had broad bipartisan support then and still does today. Unfortunately, the Fed could undermine this longstanding work done by Congress. I'd like to enter a few letters into the record, Mr. Chairman, that discuss the detrimental impact to end users. First, a joint Agricultural Trade Association letter from the American Farm Bureau Federation, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, among 7 others. Next, a joint Energy Trade Association letter from the American Gas Association and 4 others. And lastly, a letter from the American Public Power Association and the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, I'd now like to focus on how the proposal is set to significantly disincentivize banks from offering clearing services. In Dodd-Frank, Congress mandated central clearing as a way to reduce risk in the system. The number of banks that can clear derivatives for end users has reduced over time, making it harder for end users to find a bank to offer this service. There are some estimates that the Fed's proposal will increase capital for this activity by 80%. I'm worried that this will make it even harder for end users to find a bank to clear their hedges. This also comes at a time when the SEC, our friends at the Securities and Exchange Commission, has just finalized a rule in December that will increase clearing in cost in Treasury markets. This will have a real impact on market access and liquidity, not just in commodities, but the $26 trillion Treasury market that plays a critical role in the world economy. Will you work with the CFTC to address this problem?
Again, I'll say that we're aware of those concerns and we're prepared to work with other agencies and also to make sure that our capital proposal appropriately addresses them.
The strength of central clearing is entirely dependent on banks' willingness to participate, and problems with the Boswell endgame warrant a full reproposal to give us time to appreciate their consequences. And there are real consequences, as you and I both know, Mr. Chairman. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome again, Mr. Powell. It's an honor to have you before us today. I always enjoy hearing your commentary. As you know, recession and inflation, these are buzzwords, and they are used in some circumstances to cast a dim light on perhaps the Fed and others who are working to end some of these troubling circumstances we're dealing with. Are you now at a point where you believe that there will not be a recession? There was much talk about recession, and many people worried that we would find ourselves having to negotiate our way out of a recession. What is your position currently on a recession?
So U.S. growth last year was in excess of 3%. What we're seeing so far this year is continued solid growth. My expectation and that of other forecasters and of my colleagues is that we'll see continued growth at a solid pace. I will say, so there's no evidence, there's no reason to think that the U.S. economy is in or in some kind of short-term risk of falling into recession. Having said that, though, there's always a possibility, a meaningful possibility that an economy will fall into recession. I don't think that possibility, though, is elevated at the current time.
Thank you. I appreciate your saying this because we want to, at some point, eliminate the great deal of fear associated with just the term recession. Next point, the December FOMC projections showcase a slightly lower unemployment rate than last June's projections and slightly higher GDP, suggesting a soft landing remains likely. Are you of the opinion that we're headed to a soft landing, Mr. Powell?
I'll just say that what we've seen so far is an economy that's growing at a solid pace. We're seeing a labor market that is still tight, still strong. Wages are moving up, but the labor market's coming into better balance between supply and demand. And inflation has come down sharply, really, since the middle of last year. So those are the conditions we see. They're very attractive conditions, and we're trying to use our policies to keep that growth going and to keep that labor market strong while also achieving further progress on inflation. That's our goal. And do I think there's a possibility we can achieve all of that while keeping the labor market strong and the economy growing? Yes, I think there is a possibility. Indeed, that is what we're trying to achieve.
A soft landing can be difficult to identify. We could possibly have a soft landing and miss the point at which the landing took place. How do you define the soft landing such that a member of the public, a layperson, would understand that we have indeed had a soft landing?
So we really think about it in the terms I just discussed, which is we want to keep the economy growing. We want the labor market to remain strong. 3.7% unemployment is pretty near 50-year historical lows. And we want inflation to continue to move down closer and closer to that 2% objective. And we've made quite good progress on that over just the past year. So we want to continue those conditions. And I don't want to put the label on it. Other people can do that. But I would just say we're using our tools to keep a strong labor market and strong growth while making further progress on getting inflation down to 2% for the benefit of the public. That's the economy that we're trying to achieve. And I think there's we're on a good path so far to be able to get there.
Well, I concur, but I would ask this as my last question. Will there be some announcement?
Bueno, pues Powell siendo muy claro con que de momento la economía va bien, de momento el mercado laboral también está fuerte y de momento la inflación está bajando poco a poco a ese 2%. ¿Es esto un soft landing? Bueno, pues Powell no ha dicho ni que sí ni que no, pero sí que ha descrito de momento que las condiciones que podríamos asociar con un soft landing parece que se están dando. Todo esto leído entre líneas, porque Powell no se ha querido pillar los dedos diciendo absolutamente nada categóricamente. Lo que sí que ha dicho de manera categórica es que no hay ninguna razón para pensar que ahora mismo la inflación, la economía estadounidense, esté en una recesión o esté en riesgo de caer en una recesión. Dice, siempre hay una posibilidad significativa de que una economía pueda entrar en recesión, pero no creo que esa posibilidad o esa probabilidad sea muy alta ahora mismo en el caso de la economía estadounidense. Dice, de momento lo que vemos es una economía que está creciendo a un ritmo muy sólido, estamos viendo un mercado laboral muy fuerte, estamos viendo una subida en los salarios, una inflación que ha bajado de manera importantísima en los últimos 6 meses aproximadamente. Dice, son condiciones atractivas y estamos intentando utilizar nuestras políticas para mantener la economía estadounidense en un estado fuerte, en un estado sólido. Bueno, de momento sí lo está dejando caer Powell. ¿Es esto un soft landing o no? Pues no lo ha querido él confirmar, pero da la sensación de que entre líneas podemos decir o podemos leer del discurso de Powell que sí, que sería un soft landing. Seguimos escuchando las preguntas que se le están planteando.
You're hearing from our colleagues, no matter whether they be Republican or Democrat. Page 7 of your report, you don't have to go focus on it, says, while current services, core service price inflation has been slowing, but remains elevated. It does. Labor costs, as you know, and energy costs are a driver to your monetary policy. The question that I have is, because you began referencing policy, 2 weeks ago or so, the president announced that he was going to slow down the gifting of opportunities in Texas for natural gas to be able to continue the exploration. And this in Texas is a $1 trillion answer problem to us, because if we do not constantly go find through these new finds, but also through the permitting process, we're in trouble. But we're also putting in trouble our contracts that we have with Germany and a lot of other countries. this is going to mean also that business in America continues to have high prices because, as you know, wages are already high and now energy is high. There's no resiliency to continue this and see the American people win. You talked about policy. So what's your advice to policy about energy and what this administration is doing on a policy perspective?
We have, broad, significant, important responsibilities, but we're really not responsible for energy policy, and we try to avoid commenting on.
But it
things that
has
we're
a
not
huge
responsible for.
impact on this report. It arbitrarily keeps prices high. It arbitrarily means that business is not, while they're making money, and while households, people do buy that, it's diminishing their long-term advantages to make progress. So you're just going to leave that alone?
Really not appropriate for us to comment, on, if I'm commenting on energy policy, I should comment on everything.
Well,
we have a mandate, which is maximum employment and price stability. We take decisions by the legislature and by the administration as a given. We're not in charge of second guessing them. It's just not our job.
Okay, well, all right, let's say we're not going to second guess them. I will. I believe that the energy policies that this president and the Democratic Party have supported are causing a huge boom in prices staying high. They will not come down. A boom in attacking the energy industry, jobs that are associated with it, our foreign policy as it relates to contracts that we have signed with foreign countries, giving up the natural gas market almost entirely on a world market to Qatar. It has a huge impact on whether we are going to keep prices high or control these prices. It has a huge impact on, I think, your monetary report about how many houses get built, how many jobs get filled, whether we have jobs in place, whether we continue to have more jobs available than workers that are there, because over-regulation is having a lot to do with the nervousness, not only on this panel, but also by the American people. It would be my hope that you would pass some sort of a memo and tell them you have no opinion, but you want them to see what the impact is. I want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Heim, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Powell, thanks for being with us today. I have a question, but I want to start by acknowledging, not celebrating, but acknowledging what has been a really remarkable soft landing in our economy. And I'm not celebrating because the American people, consumers, are still feeling the effects of high prices. Wages haven't caught up with prices in some instances. But I think that it would be fair to say that observers would never have predicted the conduct of this economy. You yourself said it in the final press conference of 2023 when you said a very high proportion of forecasters predicted very weak growth or a recession. Not only did that not happen, we actually had a very strong year. So I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge your commitment to independent monetary policy. And because I'm still burdened with this idea that truth and facts matter, I want to point out, especially having listened to my good friend Mr. Sessions talk about the energy market, truth and facts matter. We are producing more oil and natural gas today than any other country on the planet. We are the world's #1 energy producer. I could spend my entire 5 minutes sort of pointing out facts. The fact I want to point out here, and this comes right out of the report, is that the premise that inflation is Joe Biden's fault, is fiscal policy's fault, first is faulty because half the fiscal stimulus that occurred in the face of the pandemic happened under the previous president, Donald Trump, and it has faded. And this report makes the case. Core, and I quote from it, core goods prices have been declining as supply bottlenecks ease and import price inflation falls. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't want you to comment on that because it gets a little bit political, but I do think it's important that we keep some foot on the plane of facts. I do want to ask you a question, though, Mr. Chairman, because I always worry about risks that we see and risks that we don't see. And I want to use the remainder of my time to talk about a risk you're very conscious of, which is the overhang in the commercial real estate market. As you know, the Financial Stability Oversight Council identified commercial real estate as perhaps the most salient risk to the financial system, $6 trillion roughly in loans, half of that on bank balance sheets. In a 60 Minutes interview a few weeks ago, you characterized distress in the commercial real estate market as sizable but manageable. Do you still feel like that risk is manageable? Do you feel like you've got the visibility and the transparency and the tools to address it? It makes me nervous because this has echoes of 2008, 2009, when vacancy rates were declined relatively rapidly. We're not seeing that right now. So how do you feel? Does that risk continue to be manageable, and do you have the tools to manage it?
Yeah, I would say yes to that. I think it is manageable, and we've been, working hard to management for some time now, really. And what it really is it's a lot of downtown real estate where there's too much office supply because of work from home, and also the kind of downtown retail that is no longer as profitable, and things like that are really at the heart of it. So what we've done is we've looked at banks that have significant concentrations, and we've been in touch with them to make sure that they have a plan to deal with that. There will be losses by some banks. It isn't really the big banks. It's really medium and small sized banks that have these higher concentrations. It's going to be this is a problem we'll be working through, I think, for several years. And the idea is you've got to have enough capital, enough liquidity, and a plan to take the losses that you're probably going to take. And so that's what we're doing. We're very active in this space with small, medium sized.
So let me ask you about that. Sorry to interrupt, but let me ask you about that. Silicon Valley Bank, wild irresponsibility inside the bank, egregious irresponsibility on the part of corporate treasurers who put so much on deposit. The Fed also had some self-examination to do because the examiners and the supervisors of the bank, quite frankly, were not doing what they should have been. So we might be forgiven for being a bit skeptical of claims of being on this. What has changed in the context of Silicon Valley Bank that gives you the confidence that supervisors and the examiners will be on top of this?
I see it with my own eyes, but frankly, there's a risk that we would overreact to something as significant as that. It's not like we wouldn't have reacted very, very strongly to what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, and we have. So I know that our supervisors are out there, and we're hearing back from media reports that we have been engaged with medium and small sized banks principally on this. So I am confident that we're doing the right things there. And I do believe it's a manageable problem. If that changes, then I'll say so.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemire, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Powell, for being here.
Bueno, pues interesante esta pregunta que le hacen a Powell sobre el inmobiliario comercial estadounidense. Dice el que le ha preguntado, el legislador, que Powell en una entrevista hace unas semanas habló de que el problema de la crisis del inmobiliario comercial era importante, pero que era manejable. Que si sigue de acuerdo Powell con esta afirmación que realizó unas semanas atrás. Y dice, sí, estoy de acuerdo en que sigue siendo manejable. Y dice, hemos estado trabajando mucho tiempo muy duro para resolver este problema. Dice, hemos estado mirando algunos bancos que tienen concentraciones significativas de este tipo de activos en sus balances y dice, y hemos estado en contacto con ellos y nos hemos asegurado de que tengan un plan. Dice, habrá pérdidas. Habrá pérdidas sobre todo para los bancos medianos y pequeños, que son los que más concentración de este tipo de activos tienen en sus balances. Y dice, también interesante, dice, vamos a tener que, simplemente saber que vamos a tener que convivir con este problema del inmobiliario comercial durante varios años. Así de claro, ha sido Powell. Claro, cuando le preguntan también si piensan que podemos otra vez correr el riesgo de que haya un banco como Silicon Valley Bank que no sea supervisado de una manera correcta y pueda ocurrir lo que ocurrió entonces, dice, bueno, de momento yo lo estoy viendo con mis propios ojos, hay un riesgo también de que podamos sobrereaccionar y dice, sé que los supervisores ahora mismo están ahí fuera y que estamos recibiendo feedback por parte de estos bancos, por parte de estas entidades financieras y insiste de nuevo al final de su respuesta en que piensa que es un problema manejable el de la crisis inmobiliaria comercial. Más preguntas para Powell.
A specific job, which is to assess whether an interchange fee received by a large debit issuer for processing a debit card transaction is reasonable and proportional to issuer costs. This is the obligation that Congress has bestowed upon us, not something we thought we sought, but that's our obligation under the law, and we don't know what else to do than to keep doing it for as long as that's our assignment. That's all we think we're doing. But I think that the concerns that have been raised will be things that we.
Well, hopefully you'll study this and understand that from the previous types of rules along this line, they were very detrimental to a lot of low-income, middle-income folks. As you know, the price reductions that were promised during the Durbin Amendment, for instance, the added profits actually went to the largest retailers rather than go to the consumers as they were talked about. 98% was one of the studies that showed that the retailers kept all the money instead of lowering prices as they were telling us that were going to happen. So I'm very concerned about that. So what's the legal basis for updating your regulation? You've talked about it a little bit. You believe that there is something in the law that says that you need to be doing this updating all the time, or should you be studying it before you actually propose a rule and make all these things more appropriate?
Well, again, I think our reading of the law is that it's not something you do once and leave it there. It's supposed to be reasonable and proportional to certain identified issuer costs. The implication being there, if those costs change, then this should change. So that's our reading. I think we do a lot of work. We waited a long time to change it. It's been many years since we did change it, but we do quite a bit of work to make this assessment, and we'll review the comments and the data that we get.
One of the things I hope that you consider is the fact that even though it's supposed to be on $10 billion and up, stuff all rolls downhill, and as the last study showed, the smaller banks, the community banks, are also feeling effects of this. So be sure and consider that when you start talking and thinking about this. I appreciate that. One of the things yesterday I had two different foreign banker CEOs in my office, and one of them brought up the subject to me, which is very concerning with regards to artificial intelligence being able to impact financial institutions in this country and our banking system. And I tell people, I said, think about this for a second. You find some individual who is a well-known individual, perhaps Larry Kudlow, Dave Ramsey, Bloomberg, somebody who has got credibility, and suddenly you see an artificially produced advertisement or Facebook post, and this person says, look here, we've got 100 banks that have got a problem today. Now, that individual didn't do this. It's artificially produced. I've seen a commercial already with individual. You couldn't tell the difference between that individual and the real thing. We have just come through the Silicon Valley situation. And if you have real-time payments, FedNow, where you can instantaneously transfer money, and you have people scared to death by some well-known individual through an artificial intelligence situation, and I can tell you China is watching this like a hawk. They are ready to pounce on this situation. To me, I've got some bills that actually would solve the problem. Do you think there's some issues here we need to be taking a look at?
Yeah, I think we're very focused on AI, many government agencies and law enforcement agencies in particular. It's very challenging. You paint one picture, there are lots of pictures.
Gentleman's time has expired.
It's interesting
Now
because the foreign banks actually are watching this. Thank you.
We'll now go to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Powell, thank you for being with us this morning. It's always a delight to have you before us.
Bueno, tampoco dejan hablar mucho a Powell. Los legisladores de momento le han planteado el riesgo, la amenaza que puede suponer la inteligencia artificial. Lo poco que ha respondido Powell es: estamos muy enfocados en la inteligencia artificial, igual que muchas otras agencias del gobierno, y dice, es algo que plantea muchos desafíos, y no le ha dado tiempo realmente a elaborar un poco más esa respuesta. Más cuestiones que le plantean a Powell desde el Congreso. Vamos ahora con otra legisladora.
That the growth sometime during COVID was held down due to some restrictions in COVID and restrictions on immigration. Can you detail how immigrants have been fueling our national growth? And did you consider this report from the CBO in this current report?
So I am very familiar with the CBO report. I've read the demographic projections and I've read the economic projections, so I do understand what they did. And
so you do agree with a 7 trillion growth in the next decade?
I have no judgment on that. I haven't tried to make a parallel assessment, but I'm familiar with the assessment. What they're doing is they're saying more people working, bigger economy. and it makes the economy bigger. It's just arithmetic. If you say that if you add a couple million people to an economy, and a percentage of them will work, then there will be more output, and that's what they're showing. I just want to be very, very clear, though, that we don't make immigration policy. We don't comment on immigration policy indirectly or directly.
Yeah, well, I'm not asking you to do that, but Mr. Chairman, I'm simply asking if you agree that the immigration surge has added to our strong labor force, which is necessary. I think you said that we expect a continued growth at a solid pace. So to be able to continue on a solid pace, then we need that labor force. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, so last year we got a big increase in workers, and it came from two sources. One was participation increased from people who were already here. And in addition, we got a significant increase in immigration. And many of those people take part in the working economy. And so there was a big increase in labor supply. That will have increased output. It will have made more people. It will have all kinds of economic effects. I'm just reporting the facts there.
Right.
I'm not going to say anything is needed for the future or good policy, or indirectly or directly, but I mean, I think it's just reporting the facts to say that immigration and labor force participation both contributed to the very strong economic output growth that we had last year.
Right. Is it possible for the Fed to conduct a formal assessment into the positive impact immigrants have on our economy?
Pues Powell ahora respondiendo sobre en cuestiones de inmigración, hasta qué punto una mayor inmigración y por lo tanto una mayor fuerza laboral puede tener un impacto en la economía. Dice que él no va a dedicarse a hablar del futuro, de si puede esto seguir en adelante, este tipo de tendencia, pero lo que dice es que evidentemente, en el fuerte desempeño que tuvo la economía estadounidense el año pasado, en 2023, con un crecimiento de más del 3%, aquí contribuyó también esa inmigración que hizo que aumentara la oferta de trabajadores en Estados Unidos. Dice que, hablando del pasado, los datos son los datos y que han hecho que la economía estadounidense crezca más, pero que no puede decir que esto sea necesario también para que en el futuro haya más crecimiento. Powell, como siempre, muy escéptico con poder hacer cualquier mención de algo que pueda tener una lectura política, sea del lado que sea. Seguimos escuchando a Powell.
Outcomes, and of course we're aware of that, and it plays a role in our thinking about appropriate policy and the path of the economy.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And related to that, I know that the last time that you were here, you and I talked about diversity and diversity and inclusion efforts, both at the Fed, and I applaud you and applauded the president for his appointment of Dr. Adriana Kubler. I expect to visit with her this week. What other strategies and programs are you using in the Fed, not only in here, but in all the branches to ensure that there is diversity and inclusion?
So in terms of intake of people, when we go to hire when the reserve banks go to hire a new president, those processes are very focused on having a diverse applicant pool. And you see the results of that more and more over the years. That happens. We don't have any role in appointments of governors, so that's not our job. The administration does that. In terms of, I'll just say internally, we're very focused on having an open and inclusive place to work. And also in hiring, we work hard to have diverse.
Ladies, time's
Thank you.
expired. The
Thank you, Mr.
gentleman from
Chairman.
Michigan, Mr. Heising, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Powell, good to see you in person. Mr. Chairman, I've got to make a comment here. It's stunning to me that equating an underground economy, which is very different and not a healthy alternative to the regular economy, and basing that on an illegal workforce that's not legally able to work, ultimately will fail. That is not a strategy to my colleagues on the other side. So just ask any farmer who's going to then have a regulator come in and fine them for employing people who are not legally allowed to be here in the country. That is one of their greatest fears. So that's just a fallacy of growth within this economy that is not sustainable. Chair Powell, last fall I sent Vice Chairman Barr a letter expressing my concern over the cumulative impact pending rulemakings governing products and services will have on consumers. This morning, there's been a fair amount of time spent on Basel III, but among the agencies, and here I'm including Fed, FDIC, OCC, CFPB, and the number of pending or final rules is frankly just staggering. Regulators last year finalized new rules for the Community Reinvestment Act. The Fed is also looking at Reg II, which in my opinion would unintentionally undermine recent significant progress in bringing low and moderate income consumers into the mainstream banking system. And just yesterday, the CFPB unveiled a rule that would cap late fees for banks. And I just literally walked out of a meeting with my credit unions who are very concerned about those things that may be in their future as well. So I think it's critical that we don't look at any of these rules in a vacuum, and we need to consider their total impact and full scope on that. So I'm going to ask you a question I've asked some of the other regulators. How much do you, as the Fed, and you personally, consult with other agencies on their own rulemaking agenda? Do you coordinate? Do you talk?
So I don't lead that area of our business, but I know there's a lot of talking, coordination. I'm not sure there is coordination.
We're in government. There's always a lot of talking. I'm concerned about the coordinating. All right. Well, let me ask you this way. When a rule is finalized under another regulator, are you mandated or have any kind of policy to go back and look at your other pending rules under your purview and see if changes need to be made because of these other agencies' rule makings?
There's no mandate like that. I think where it made sense to do that, though, we would do it.
But you genuinely have some sort of review of that. It's conscious.
I don't think there is a formal review.
Okay.
No.
I've heard repeatedly that elements of Basel III overlap with the Fed's annual stress tests. What are you going to do to address that overlap?
So we're in the middle of just at the beginning, actually, of deciding what to do about Basel III. And part of that may be the interaction with stress tests. So I haven't got anything for you on that today, but that's certainly an issue that presents itself.
Would like to continue that conversation. I do want to touch on the bank failures of last year very quickly. Do you think that the banks that ultimately needed the government bailout lacked sufficient capital, or was it more of a management problem?
So with Silicon Valley Bank, it wasn't really, could they have used more capital? I mean, they were actually raising capital. It was a capital raise that they announced that triggered the run and everything. So you can argue that it needed more capital, but I wouldn't say that that was the proximate cause, really. It was a funding structure that was all about too much concentration of
well, many of us are, I'm asking the question because many of us are very concerned that those failures are being used as an excuse to raise capital standards across the board. And because the SEC just released its climate disclosure rule this morning, I'm going to touch on the climate related question for you. The FSOC chair has repeatedly stated that climate change is, quote, an existential threat. Presumably a threat that is existential affects banks.
Bueno, pues más preguntas para Powell. En primer lugar, este legislador le ha preguntado si otras agencias del gobierno se coordinan a la hora de llevar a cabo algunas nuevas normas. Aquí lo que dice es que hay mucha conversación, pero no se atreve a hablar de coordinación. También le han preguntado por nueva regulación financiera, concretamente por Basilea III. Dice que de momento están en el principio de tomar alguna decisión respecto a Basilea III. Y también se le ha preguntado por la caída de los bancos regionales estadounidenses el año pasado, empezando por Silicon Valley Bank y terminando por First Republic Bank. Bueno, le ha preguntado este legislador a Powell hasta qué punto estas caídas se debieron a que no contaban con el capital necesario en estos bancos o si se debía realmente a un problema de gestión de estas entidades financieras. Lo que dice Powell, que tampoco le ha dejado terminar, es que para Silicon Valley Bank podían haber utilizado más capital. De hecho, el problema vino de una ampliación de capital, precisamente, que fue lo que acabó dinamitando todo. Y dice, bueno, realmente el problema estaba en su estructura, donde había demasiada concentración, y ahí le ha cortado el legislador, así que Powell no ha podido terminar esa idea. Bueno, veo que hay otra legisladora ahora haciendo preguntas a Powell. Vamos a escuchar qué es lo que le plantean.
But it probably had something to do with it. For me, not a major.
So that's no?
That's very small.
Okay, so it did. Okay. So do you agree the appropriate rules on incentive compensation could have reduced the likelihood of Silicon Valley's failure? Maybe? You know, if they didn't take
No,
all
I
that
really
money?
don't think so. I mean,
So if they
I
didn't
don't think
take all
it's,
that money?
I don't think it's a first order question for Silicon Valley. A lot went wrong there.
Yeah,
Incentive comp would be.
they actually blame
way
you
down the
guys.
list.
They
Sorry.
blame the oversight, even though they didn't respond to your
That's part of it.
correspondences.
We took our medicine.
Yeah. Do you think it also has something to do with the fact that Section 956 of the Dodd-Frank rule hasn't been finalized by you?
No, I don't.
You don't think it's the reason?
I don't.
You don't think it's because people made money off of the failure?
I think
You
nothing.
don't think money drove them to do what they did?
I didn't say that. What I said, there are lots
So
of.
they made money from it. They actually, it was a lottery
do
for
not
them, right?
think that incentive compensation arrangements were at the heart of the Silicon Valley Bank failure. No.
Okay. Do you support a robust rulemaking for executive compensation, Chairman?
I know that the.
Oh, you don't?
I'm sorry?
Oh, that's the simple. Do you support robust rulemaking for executive compensation? Do you believe in Section 956?
Section 956 is the law. As I understand it, the agencies are looking at doing something. It's been 12 or 13 years, right?
Yeah, multiple
Nothing has
agencies.
happened.
Yeah.
It's been hard to get it done. I lived through the last episodes of trying
Yeah.
to get it done.
So do you believe in a robust
I
rulemaking
believe,
process for executive compensation?
I do, yeah.
Oh, great. Oh, that's awesome. Will you commit to helping finalize the Dodd-Frank section of 956?
Pues continúan las preguntas respecto a Silicon Valley Bank. En este sentido, bueno, le han preguntado si había problemas con las compensaciones a los ejecutivos de los bancos. Dice que hubo muchas cosas que se hicieron mal en Silicon Valley Bank y aquí la legisladora le responde rápidamente a Powell y le dice, bueno, muchas cosas, pero ellos les culpan más bien a ustedes, a los reguladores por no haberles supervisado de la manera correcta. Dice Powell, nosotros ya tomamos de nuestra medicina, dando por hecho que se dieron cuenta de que en Silicon Valley Bank quizá pecaron de no haber supervisado lo suficiente y ahora es lo que están haciendo, que de hecho Powell ya lo ha dicho, estamos supervisando muchos bancos, estamos en contacto con ellos, hablando con ellos, instándoles a que tienen que llevar a cabo planes en el caso de que pueda haber pérdidas por el inmobiliario comercial, que ya ha dicho Powell que es un problema considerable, de considerable tamaño, pero manejable. Bueno, pues aquí Powell dice, hemos tomado de nuestra propia medicina. Curioso que diga esto el presidente de la Fed. Seguimos escuchándole.
Clawback and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something I know you've been looking at for a while.
Yeah.
That's certainly an appropriate thing to look at.
Yeah, because it's just going to continue to happen, is my opinion. It doesn't have to be yours, but it sure the heck could have helped here if they knew they were going to walk away, if they could walk away with not the bonuses, the compensation. I mean, they made money, a significant amount of money for their bank failure. Last question, Chair Powell. Do you believe that the impacts of climate change pose a risk? Have you been talking about that more?
I certainly believe that climate change is real and poses risks over the longer term, sure.
So there have been some that say, higher interest rates it actually makes it more difficult to build out the renewable energy projects and other investments required to prevent climate impacts. Do you believe that to be true?
It's not I believe that we need to do our job that you've assigned us, which is maximum employment and price stability, and we do it through interest rates. It's not our job to consider the effect on climate change of that. And I think any effect on climate change of that would be kind of minuscule.
Okay. Last question, Chair Powell, who do you see as the major winners and losers from high interest rates in terms of income groups, age groups, and racial or other demographics?
So the point of high interest rates in the current environment is to bring inflation under control. The people who are hurt the most by inflation, as you know, are people who are on a fixed income, who right away are in trouble when the cost of transportation, food, energy, and when those things go up, they don't have financial resources to deal with it.
Have you looked
We're
at the-
accountable to provide price stability to the American people. Those people benefit the most over time from stable prices.
Gentlelady's time's expired. We'll go to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you, Chair Powell, for your service. I want to associate myself with the comments of my colleague, Mr. Himes. I am concerned about banks' commercial real estate exposure, and I do hope that the Fed is doing everything it can to ensure that the exposure that these banks have will continue to be, in your words, manageable, because this is a looming crisis out there, given the workplace changes and dynamics. Chair Powell, in remarks on Bloomberg, Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary during the Obama administration, stated that, and I quote, "It would be much more productive for our central bank to be focused on the question of real estate portfolios in the banks they supervise than, quote, some of the more abstract and politically driven arguments that about various kinds of capital charges on the largest banks." Do you agree, sir, that it would be more productive for Fed supervisors and regulators to keep their eye on the ball, in this case, commercial real estate and other real estate investments?
I absolutely think we need to keep our eye on the ball on commercial real estate. And, I think we're doing that.
I hope so. According to your semi-annual report, the median of members on your Monetary Policy Committee estimate that your target overnight interest rate will average 4.1% in 2024. Does that mean that the median number of members anticipate that you will be cutting interest rates sometime this year by as much or more than a full percentage point?
No, it doesn't mean that. Actually, the summary of economic projections showed a median of, this is in the December FOMC, so this is now 3 months old, showed 3 rate cuts this year. So that would be 75 basis points, 3/4 of 1 percentage point. You were quoting the next year's number, so you would add that on. That was through 2025, I believe.
So are you anticipating that there would be more cuts?
So what
You're coming?
It's not, the way I would say it is, we're making economic projections. And so we write down a path of growth, what's happening in the labor market, what happens with inflation, and what goes with those forecasts is an appropriate monetary policy, appropriate interest rates. So we expect inflation to come down, the economy to keep growing, the labor market to remain strong. And if that's the case, it will be appropriate for interest rates to come down, significantly over the coming years.
Good.
What will really happen, though, it's not a plan. What will happen is actually what the economy needs. The economy will do something different from that, and that's what will actually happen.
Chairman Powell, 15 members of Congress, including myself, Ranking Member Sherman, Chairman Barr, and Ranking Member Foster, sent a letter to the prudential regulators regarding the impact that Basel will have on U.S. capital markets activities. The letter highlighted critical areas of our U.S. markets, including securities underwriting, securitization, and derivatives that will be severely impacted by the Basel proposal. This was also a common theme represented throughout the comment file on the Basel proposal, over 95% of them. Considering that 75% of financing in the U.S. is done through our capital markets.
Bueno, le ha hablado esta legisladora Powell sobre una estimación que hay en el mercado de que la Reserva Federal va a acabar con unos tipos de interés del 4,1% en torno al próximo año. Bueno, le ha preguntado a Powell si esto significa que los tipos van a bajar en más de un punto o en un punto porcentual en los próximos 12 meses. Dice Powell que no significa eso, que de hecho en sus últimas proyecciones, que fueron ya en diciembre, es decir, hace ya 3 meses, con lo que aquí el presidente de la Fed sugiere que quedan un poco viejas, un poco antiguas, dice la perspectiva de la Fed era tener 3 bajadas de tipos este año, es decir, 75 puntos básicos, sugiriendo que cada bajada era 25 puntos básicos. Y dice, claro, ese 4,1% que está usted mencionando es lo que se esperaba para el año siguiente, para 2025. Y dice, claro, nosotros estamos aquí haciendo proyecciones económicas, pensamos que la economía va a tomar un camino concreto en términos de crecimiento y, por lo tanto, creemos que será apropiado que los tipos de interés bajen de manera significativa en los próximos años. ¿Cuánto y cuándo? Concretamente, bueno, pues Powell dice que eso no lo sabe nadie, que eso simplemente lo va a determinar la economía. Powell no quiere avanzar nada. Seguimos escuchando a esta legisladora.
On its jurisdiction.
We do not comment on other agencies' regulation. However, if they were actually, to take your hypothetical at face value, if they were to come into our jurisdiction.
Oh, it's more than a hypothetical.
And we would react.
Good. Well, I hope you do. I yield back.
Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right here.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for being here, Chairman Powell. Property insurance rates are becoming prohibitively expensive or inaccessible for homeowners and developers in my community. The FSOC's annual report identifies property insurance rates as an increasing risk, and I recently raised this issue with Secretary Yellen. Is the Fed monitoring the rising cost of insurance and its impact on macroeconomic?
Is this mic off?
We'll pause the clock.
Parece que tenía algún problema Jerome Powell para hablar. Vamos a ver si le resuelven ese problemilla con el micrófono. Parece que no, que hay algún problemilla para que Powell pueda seguir respondiendo a esas preguntas. Bueno, vamos a ver si se puede resolver en los próximos minutos. Veo que ni siquiera lo están enfocando al presidente de la Reserva Federal. De hecho, estoy leyendo que van a suspender de momento la sesión por ahora, temporalmente. Así que nosotros vamos a dedicarnos a seguir mirando lo que está ocurriendo en el mercado. Ya saben que ya son las 5:30 de la tarde. Es hora de mirar a los mercados europeos y vamos a hacerlo antes de que retome la sesión, que parece que se ha estropeado algo del micrófono del presidente de la Reserva Federal, que no podía responder a esa última pregunta. Así que vamos ya con ese repaso del cierre del mercado europeo. Vamos a enseguida a ir con ello. Jornada hoy bastante tranquila en esos mercados europeos, básicamente porque, bueno, pues hemos tenido una sesión sin demasiado alboroto. Es verdad que con subidas, además, que han rozado el 1% en algunos índices del viejo continente. Y mientras tanto en Estados Unidos, mientras estaba hablando Powell y estaba, bueno, apoyando un poco la versión que tiene ya todo el mercado sobre lo que opina la Reserva Federal, es decir, bajadas de tipo sí, cuando no se sabe, pero pronto parece que no, porque no están sugiriéndolo. De hecho, tenemos a los índices ahora mismo con subidas del 0,9 en el caso del Nasdaq, del 0,7% para el S&P 500 y en el caso del Dow Jones lo tenemos también con subidas del 0,6%, todo en positivo, con Powell hablando en el Congreso y sin causar sobresaltos en el mercado. Ahora sí, vamos a repasar el cierre del mercado europeo.
Admirals invierte sin comisiones en más de 4.000 activos.
Bueno, pues ya tenemos el cierre del mercado europeo y atención porque, como les decía, jornada tranquila, pero ojo con el IBEX, que acaba la sesión del día de hoy justo en los 10.200 puntos, 0,8% de subida, 10.200 clavados, 10.200,3 concretamente. El resto de índices también en Europa en positivo, 0,5% de subida para el Eurostoxx 50, 0,3 para el CAC 40, MIPTEL italiano 0,7, DAX alemán 0,08 y el IBEX, como les decía, 10.200 puntos, 0,8% de repunte en el día de hoy. Vamos a ver por dentro el selectivo porque hoy, aunque en la parte baja no son muchos los valores que han terminado hoy aquí, en esta parte de la lista, hay uno que sin duda se lleva el premio al más bajista. Grifols, 12% casi de subida al cierre, de caída, perdón, al cierre. 11,89% de retroceso, 6,85 euros la acción. Así ha cerrado la cotización de Grifols, compañía que ya ha vuelto a ser atacada de nuevo por Gotham City Research por un nuevo informe que vuelve a relacionar a sus filiales, a las filiales de Grifols, a GEMA y a BPC, con ese family office de la familia Grifols, con Scranton Enterprises. Todo esto ha vuelto a poner la lupa en torno a Grifols y ha hecho que la compañía hoy se desplome más de un 11%, casi un 12% al cierre de la sesión. Celnex, lo segundo peor del día, aunque fíjense la diferencia que hay entre caídas, uno cae un 11,89, Celnex, la segunda, cae un 1,49, o sea, muchísimo menos. Luego tenemos a Naturgy, también 0,5% de caída, Enagas 0,2%, Robi 0,2%, Solaria 0,09% y Repsol, que termina la sesión muy plano con un 0,07% de retroceso. En la parte de arriba tenemos aquí a IAG, con más de un 5% de subida al cierre de la jornada. Endesa acaba con un 3,2%, Fluidra 2,4%, rozando el 2,5%, y Unicaja lo tenemos con un 2,16% de alza. Amadeus, SACIR, BVA, todos en torno al 2% de subida en una jornada tranquila, a la espera, por cierto, de mañana va el Banco Central Europeo. Ya saben que es jueves de BCE, tenemos reunión de tipos y ojo a lo que se avecina, porque va a ser interesante lo que nos diga Lagarde. Powell hoy, aunque es verdad que no ha sido una rueda de prensa de tipos de interés, lo que hemos tenido es básicamente que, bueno, pues Powell ha reiterado un poco los mensajes que ya conocíamos, que ya teníamos de la Reserva Federal. Un Powell que hemos escuchado que sigue insistiendo en lo mismo de que la inflación está bajando, que tiene que todavía bajar un poco más y que el objetivo de la Fed sigue siendo el mismo, 2% de inflación. ¿Qué es lo que dice Powell? Pues que no va a haber seguramente una recesión. De hecho, no ha querido tampoco sugerir que se puede decir otra cosa. Dice que no hay ningún motivo para pensar que ahora mismo estamos en una recesión, y cuando le han preguntado si va a haber soft landing tampoco ha querido confirmar que estemos en una situación así, pero dice que, bueno, pues que se están dando cosas muy positivas, entre otras pues que el crecimiento de la economía va muy bien, que está en un ritmo sólido, que tenemos ya ese mercado laboral muy sólido también y muy fuerte. Y bueno, pues este ha sido un poco el resumen de momento de lo que ha dicho Jerome Powell, y hasta aquí este repaso del cierre del mercado europeo.
Admirals invierte sin comisiones en más de 4.000 activos.
Pues ahora ya sí, vuelve a reanudarse la sesión en el Congreso de Estados Unidos. Powell vuelve a hablar después de esos fallos técnicos con el sonido, que no se le escuchaba al presidente de la Fed. Vamos a escucharle.
And reiterate the importance of the rulemaking on Section 956. This is an issue that I also raised with Vice Chair Barr, Chairman Grunberg, Acting Comptroller Sue, and I told them when they came before this committee that I will be asking for a status update on the rulemaking at every future hearing, because it's well past time, 12, 13, 14 years. If you are employed in a company and you are given a task, I will think that you will be fired if you don't get it done, and it has taken 12 long years. So you are the chairman of the Fed. How is the Fed working with other agencies to propose the rule?
So there's a lot going on in regulation at the Fed right now. My understanding on 956 is that there have been discussions between the regulatory agencies, and I think it's not 3, I think it's more like 6 agencies that have to agree.
I know.
I have not seen a proposal. I think something is under consideration, but it's not something that's gotten to me yet.
I will ask the next time, and believe me, I'll be here.
Great.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, good to see you. You have said numerous times that the capital framework is about right and that banks are well capitalized. Do you still believe this?
I do.
Given that you believe that, and given the fact that the Basel III Endgame proposal dramatically increases capital requirements on banks, would a reproposal that implemented Basel III in a capital neutral way, could it do so without jeopardizing financial stability?
Could. I mean, hypothetically, yeah.
Okay. According to Latham and Watkins, 97% of the comment letters either opposed, called for a reproposal, or expressed substantial concerns about the Basel III Endgame proposal. And those negative comments came from across the ideological spectrum and from various interests. Without objection, I would ask the chair to include that report into the record. Without objection, I'd ask the chair to include that report.
Without objection.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, did you see that report?
I did.
Does that concern you, that 97% of the comments were negative?
So we didn't do our own count, so I can't make an assessment, but I would say it's unlike anything I've seen.
The Basel III comment period ended on the same day as the Fed's data collection on the proposal, which is an odd process since the data should have been collected far earlier, analyzed, and the results should have been available for the public to comment on before the comment period ended. Why did the Federal Reserve choose to do a quantitative impact study during the comment period for the proposal, foreclosing any ability by the public to comment on the results of the study?
Well, I mean, the movie's not over. We are where we are. And Vice Chair Barr did commit to putting the QIS out for comment. We will receive those comments, and those comments will be taken into consideration as we think about the path ahead.
Well, speaking of process, you've got your excellent general counsel right behind you there. And I don't want to get into privilege here, but have the lawyers at the Fed raised any process concerns or Administrative Procedure Act issues with the board?
Let me just say that we're committed to doing transparent and reasonable and data-based rulemaking in compliance with the Administrative Procedure Act.
Well, of course, giving the public the ability to comment on the quantitative data that has been provided obviously is consistent with good process. Sir, Governors Bowman and Waller, Vice Chair Hill, and Director McKernan all dissented on the proposal, and Vice Chair Jefferson expressed concerns with it during his statement. Under your tenure as chair, can you identify any other regulatory proposal which has elicited this much dissent?
No.
Have you in the past acknowledged in front of this committee that you will not move forward with proposals without consensus, or you have acknowledged that in the past, and we appreciate that commitment to consensus. Have you achieved consensus yet on the Basel proposal?
Let me say I am confident that we will. But that's a process that as I mentioned, we're evaluating the comments. We're just coming to the place where we're going to start talking about the path ahead. And I am confident that we'll achieve very broad support on the board.
Mr. Chairman, do you agree that the heterogeneity and business model diversity within the banking sector contributes to system-wide financial stability?
I strongly do.
And do you agree that a concentrated business model in the banking sector would present a potentially systemic risk?
Potentially, yeah.
And this is one of my major concerns with the proposal, Mr. Chairman, because by de facto repealing regulatory tailoring, subjecting Category 3 and 4 regional banks to one-size-fits-all standards that currently only apply to large GSIBs, discouraging securitization, which is the private sector solution for dispersing risk, eliminating the use of internal risk models and transitioning the industry and regulators toward only a standardized framework actually would push the industry into a smaller and more concentrated looking industry, and as a result would in my view actually increase systemic risk and decrease market competition. Do you share that concern?
I think it's a real concern. And again, I think that's part of what goes into my thinking certainly about the proposal and where it needs to go.
Well, given all of these concerns, we hope that you can commit to reproposing the Basel III endgame, and we strongly urge you to take that into consideration. With that, Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Welcome. Good to see you again. I want to go a little deeper into the commercial real estate issue and the potential impact on regional banks. This morning, Scott Rector, who's a member of the New York Fed Board of Directors, released a white paper on CNBC this morning describing the trillions of dollars in commercial real estate loans that will come due over the next couple of years. He described it as a, quote, slow-moving train wreck, close quote, and for our regional banks. He went on to predict that it will force a little over 500 banks, thereabouts, to either fail or consolidate. He also described what he termed as a doom loop where, similar to Silicon Valley Bank, when people lose confidence, when depositors lose confidence in the bank, they pull their money out and we end up in a bad situation. Now, I don't believe everything that I read or hear, but in Congress, we do tend to repeat it. And I just wanted to get a sense from you. I am seeing in my own city of Boston, we've got 20% vacancy rates in office space. We rely on that for a lot of the tax revenues for the city. But I'm just wondering your thoughts on that issue. Is there a systemic concern here, or is this isolated? And might lowering the interest rates help some of those banks? Because I hear from my developers in our area that no one's lending. So You got a crack at it?
Sure. So I haven't seen that report, so I can't comment on it, but I can comment on commercial real estate. So we've had a secular change in the economy, which has left office rentals in many places, office buildings. The demand for them is significantly lower, at least temporarily, and perhaps for a long time. And also the same is true for downtown, in some places, downtown retail that's associated with office workers. So it's a shock to the system, and we've known this for some time, and we've gone through the commercial banks in the United States and so have the other regulators. We've done it jointly and identified the ones that have high concentration and are going to need to deal with that. And so we've been in contact with those banks and talking to them about how they're going to deal with this. How are they going to absorb these losses? Do they have enough capital? Do they have the liquidity? Do they have a plan to do this? And is it consistent with their lending practices and that kind of thing? So it's going to be something we work through over a period of years. I do think it's slow moving. I think that part of it is right. You ask about 500 banks. I have no idea about that number, but certainly there would be some banks, probably smaller ones, that have these high concentrations. It's not the very large banks. It's really a manageable thing at the large banks. So I think that's what it's going to be, and it's a serious problem, and more serious in some locations and jurisdictions and with some banks than others. But it's one we'll be working through, and I think that's how I would think about it.
Does the Silicon Valley Bank situation, Signature, the money moves so quickly in those cases. It was instantaneous now. The velocity of money moving out of those banks really, I think, in some ways contributed to their failures. Are we looking at anything technologically that might be able to address some of that or mitigate it?
Sure. So we also, after Silicon Valley Bank, we got in contact with and worked with financial institutions that had high concentrations of uninsured deposits. And many of them have greatly improved their liquidity position. So that's the thing that we're working on. Okay. As you probably know, we're also working on some liquidity rules, which will strengthen our framework of liquidity rules. But that's something we haven't proposed yet.
Let me ask you something off topic. So we know that Russia has about $300 billion in U.S. We've frozen assets, Russian assets of about $300 billion between U.S. and European banks. You want to comment on that? What I'd like to see is us give that to Ukraine, to be honest with you. I know that's a very simplistic idea, but I'm just wondering if there's any historic example that we could look to if Congress has to take the necessary steps to redirect that money to Ukraine so they can feed their people and fight that war.
This whole area of sanctions and foreign assets and things like that is really controlled and directed by the administration, by the elected branch of government. All we are is just a technical seat around, in the back row to help. We don't make those decisions, and I wouldn't comment.
I know you're big on history. I was just wondering if there was any examples out there that we might provide guidance to us.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here. When I'm back in my district in Texas, I'm constantly hearing concerns surrounding the fundamentally flawed Basel III. We've talked at length about that today, endgame proposal. These concerns are not only coming from my banking industry, but also from farmers, ranchers, small business owners who are concerned about how this proposal will impact the ability to access capital in the future. And to all of us, did it not raise alarms? And we've heard about the 97% today of public comments on this proposal, and they all came out negative. And Americans across all sectors are worried about the disastrous implications that will follow this proposal and have tried to make that known to banking regulators who continue to ignore them. It is time for federal regulators to take these concerns seriously and, quite frankly, I believe, start over. So I urge you and your colleagues to rethink the misguided policy and do what's best for American people, small business, Main Street America, and withdraw the Basel III proposal. Now, Chairman Powell, given the concerns raised by financial institutions, again, farmers, ranchers, et cetera, and other communities across the country, can you elaborate on how the Federal Reserve is responding to and addressing these comments that are mostly negative and request modification, delay, or complete withdrawal of the proposal of Basel?
Yes, I will. So we're in the process of reviewing the comments. They were quite voluminous. They were very detailed, a lot of data, a lot of analysis, and that's just what we wanted. So we got those, and now it's a lot. It's hundreds of them, and we're going through them, and we're just at the point where we're about to begin then turning to the question of what changes should we make to the proposal. We haven't made any decisions. We haven't really gotten to that stage yet, but remember, we only got the comments less than 2 months ago. So it's just, we're at that stage. So we're looking at it. As I've mentioned, my own view is that there will be material and broad changes to the proposal as we go forward. And we haven't really made decisions yet, though. It's just a little bit early for that.
We're glad you're looking at it. I want to bring up the long-term debt proposal rule, which would require banks to issue enough long-term debt to cover capital losses. Now, Congress worked to pass legislation requiring the tailoring of regulations to the size of a financial institution. This is meant to protect banks of all sizes and allow for families and businesses in my district to have options to meet their lending needs. So the Fed's long-term debt proposal would undo any sort of regulatory tailoring and puts into place a new long-term debt issuance requirements on regional banks, which require these banks to issue long-term debt both at the parent holding company level and the IDI level. Now, these regional banks will face increased costs when they are already facing towering regulatory burdens from this administration, and those are the banks that people do business with. So, Mr. Chairman, do you believe that this proposal rule goes against the requirements of S2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, and will you commit to exploring this issue further with your colleagues?
So we're committed to implementing 2155. We believe that the regulatory and supervision of regulation and supervision of banks needs to reflect their size and activities, and that's something we'll be considering as we go forward with this.
Okay, short time I got left. Americans continue to feel the pain from runaway inflation created by the Biden administration as everyday costs continue to stay expensive. As you know, I'm in the car business, and inflation is just running rampant in my industry. And the irresponsible and partisan American Rescue Plan forced through Congress by Democrats only made inflation more of a problem. And now American families and businesses have been forced to deal with runaway inflation for 3 full years now, which has caused some major hardships. So quickly, the ARPA injected nearly $2 trillion of deficit spending to our already struggling economy. And how does this type of inflated spending combined with economic headwinds like supply chain shortages impact the economy? And doesn't this kind of reckless spending actually fuel the pressures of inflation?
I think there are a lot of causes of the inflation we've seen. We saw this inflation everywhere in the world. So the reopening of the economy after with very strong demand and constrained supply, you saw inflation in all the advanced economies. It was a little sharper here at the beginning. I think there's a role for monetary policy in that. There's a role for fiscal policy. There's a role for the pandemic, a starring role for the pandemic. Our job is to deal with it, and that's what we've been doing.
Well, thank you for always keeping small business in Main Street America in your calculations. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for recognizing in your opening statement the importance of immigrants in keeping costs down. And I want to thank you and the administration for what has been an excellent 2023 economic report. We've got 3.1% economic growth, by far the best in the developed world. Headline inflation, 2.4%. And that's not a little blip, a 1-month number. That's for the whole of 2023 and compares very favorably with the pre-pandemic portion of the Trump administration when we had inflation of 3.5%. My goal here is to convince you to cut more and sooner because for a number of reasons. The first is that I know, if you ask a constituent, they want zero inflation and zero unemployment. You know that we can't have that and have concluded that the economy works best with a 2% inflation rate target. But I've looked at the history of that 2% number. It seems to come from Auckland from the 1980s. And there's a lot of arguments that your target should be just a little bit higher. Larry Summers recently produced a study arguing that the cost of money is part of the cost of living. So we have this weird paradox where you're trying to keep the cost of groceries down by raising interest rates. But as the ranking member points out, the big issue is housing. And your measure of inflation seems to treat all Americans as renters, even though 2/3 are homeowners. And so when interest rates go up, that's an increase in the cost of living for anyone with an adjustable rate mortgage, anybody looking to buy a house, anybody with a home equity loan. Obviously, we would cut interest rates a little sooner and a little more if your target was something closer to 2.3%. So I'll ask you, is there substantial economic analysis that argues that your target rate and the economy would work better if we had a slightly higher target than 2%?
Not really, no. What's happened is, you pointed out New Zealand, but what's happened is that 2% has become the global standard. And it's a pretty durable standard. I don't have any reason to think that it's a problem for the United States to get to 2% inflation. You know, we're at 2.4% right now, headline inflation.
I would ask leave to add to the transcript of this hearing numerous articles that argue for something between 2.3 and even 3%. I'm not arguing for as high as 3%. Let's look at Basel. There's nothing free here. If the standards are too high, we lose economic growth. If they're too low, we have bailouts and bankruptcies. But I think everybody agrees that the standard should be well crafted. You've got a system where everybody drafting this is well dressed and focused on Wall Street. And you've got Basel rules that discriminate against Main Street and for Wall Street. I'll give you some examples. 65 basis, it's 65% if you're a publicly traded company and make a loan to a publicly traded company. You make a loan to CalPERS, they're not publicly traded, without objection, I'd like to put in their article into the record. And so they're in effect going to have a tougher time getting a loan. The local pizzeria is going to have a tougher time getting a loan. You've got in Basel III ignoring mortgage insurance, which obviously makes the loan more prudentially sound for the bank and is very necessary for first-time home buyers. And you've got a system where if you make investments in long-term bonds on Wall Street and you put them in the hold to maturity category, you don't have to recognize the losses and mark to market. So I hope you'll look at these in terms of the competition between Wayne Street and Wall Street for bank loans. Finally, we go to clean energy investment. Can I count on you to personally look at the paradox where Basel III treats clean energy tax credits much more harshly than low-income housing tax credits for no ascertainable reason? Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Powell, thank you for being here today. I'm concerned with the small dollar credit for businesses. As a former business owner for over 20 years, I can attest that as the small dollar business credit becomes more expensive and less convenient, businesses are going to turn to credit cards and other alternative financing for business purchases. These inevitably result in even higher costs, which goes down to the consumer, which means that they're going to pay more for the services or the products. But in February of this year, total credit card debt reached a record of $1.7 trillion. According to Intuit's Small Business Index annual report, average monthly credit card balances were 27% higher in 2023 than they were in 2019. What do you view as the driving force behind these record high levels of credit card debt?
Part of it would be growth in the economy. So that'll be part of it, just that it's a bigger economy and a bigger number. I'm not sure what that is. You know, as you know, people had lots of extra cash during the pandemic from forced savings. They've spent that down. Now they're borrowing. I'm not sure.
So if there was a rule to force banks to tighten lending, do you think the rule would drive businesses and consumers to alternative forms of credit?
I do. I think, if you raise lending costs for banks, then at the margin that will make non-bank lenders, they'll get some of that business.
And if it becomes more complex or less convenient, then businesses will turn to these alternative forms like credit card. I can tell you that from experience. Yes. Well, I've called for the withdrawal of the Basel III endgame proposal entirely. Will you commit to an analysis of how bank capital proposals like Basel affect small business credit access and the small dollar lending before finalizing such proposals?
I commit to that. Let me look into that. I don't want to make a commitment that I'll undertake some big study, but we'll look at the issue.
But do you feel it's important that we do have an understanding the effect it's going to have on small businesses? The backbone, it's the bloodline of our
and they
economy.
create the jobs. That's right. I do agree. Yeah.
Okay. The chairman asked you for your thoughts on withdrawing or reproposing the Basel III endgame proposal. Have you specifically discussed withdrawing the proposal with Vice Chairman Michael Barr or the other governors?
So I don't want to get into our internal, doing.
Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos un día más a Cripto Negocios, bienvenidos al programa Cripto de referencia de la televisión española, con todo el análisis, con toda la actualidad, como siempre contando con los mejores expertos pendientes de Bitcoin en torno a los $67.000 después de tocar máximos históricos en el día de ayer, luego vino una caída, ha vuelto a recuperar la zona de los $67.000 pendientes de las palabras de Jerome Powell, el presidente de la Reserva Federal, que dice que será apropiado que la Fed baje tipos significativamente en los próximos años. Sigue dejando abierta la puerta a más recortes de tipos. Escuchamos a Jerome Powell.
At the Fed on proposals like B3E. Are you concerned with recent trends of disagreement among board members related to major proposals?
So I think we're going to get to broad consensus at the Fed. I do. I think it's very important. This has been our culture that we try to find common ground, and we've been able to do that in the regulatory space, and I expect we will be here as well. And I'm committed to that.
Could it be that we're seeing this level of disagreement because of extreme measures that are being taken now that may not have been taken in the past? I mean, a total difference of opinion and understanding and philosophy regarding free market economy.
I won't speculate, but I will point out that 4 of the 7 governors during the open board meeting at which we put it out for comment expressed real concerns, very specific concerns about the proposal, and said we would look at the comments when they came in, and that's what we're doing.
All right. Do you feel that they have validity in their concerns?
I was one of the 4, so yes.
All right. With the few seconds I have remaining, there's a recent report of FinCEN working with financial institutions to query legal purchases made by American citizens. Has the Federal Reserve been instructed within the past 3 years by Treasury or anyone else to search Americans' legal transactions?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. As Ben remarked, there's a near-term emergency to get the $60 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. And separate from that, there remains a longer-term need for reconstruction assistance to Ukraine, which the World Bank estimates is somewhere north of $400 billion. Now, at the start of the Russian invasion, the free democracies of the world froze roughly $300 billion in Russian currency assets, primarily at European banks and financial institutions. And the Biden administration and many of our allies have recently taken the stance that those assets should be leveraged somehow to provide reconstruction resources to Ukraine. I support this concept, and I believe that additional action should be taken to ensure that we hold Russia accountable. But there are real concerns on the impact that this might have on central banking system, on the primacy of the dollar, the euro, and so on. And so my question is, have you seen just the act of freezing these assets and not seizing them, but simply freezing them? Have you seen deleterious effects on the primacy of the dollar, the confidence in the central banking system? Is there any visible downside from the act of freezing that's visible so far in the 2 years since we've done it?
I can't point to any. I can't point to any.
Okay, so that's an interesting observation when we think of taking the additional step of actually seizing them, that at least so far, because, you know, to my mind, having them frozen is as violent as, and as violent as seizing them outright. And so that's interesting that so far we haven't seen that. Now, in terms of the Basel III and so on, there is there's a frustration I've had over the fact that directionally the effects of these are clear, but the magnitude of effects are not. You know, for example, if you talk about the effect on the prices seen by derivative end users of increased capital requirement, directionally it's clear. If you raise capital requirements, banks will withdraw from these markets to some extent. Other players will step in partly and take up part of the slack, and the spreads will increase and so on. Is the data that you've collected enough for you to actually estimate the magnitude of these effects instead of simply the direction?
I think it's really hard to get down to the micro level and try to assess that, because you're right, there would be multiple effects. But you do know that you know the direction, you know what the sign is.
That's right. But you know, if you can avoid financial crises with a microscopic increase in prices seen by end users, that's one thing. If it's a very large difference in the price, so that the magnitude matters a lot when you're doing these balancing things. And a lot of it depends on, actually, you need a model for how the different market players will react. And is that really not going to be in the scope of the analysis that you anticipate from the quantitative?
I believe we have done some work on that. And I think the banks and other participants have done work on that as well and come up with a range of answers. But you know, this is I mean, there are just an awful lot of variables in these equations. So it's hard to say with any confidence. I mean, that's why it's hard to, the job of deciding the precise level of appropriate capital is a hard one.
Yeah. And now with, with 10 years, we've had two major crises with both a fiscal and a monetary response. Are there the lessons that you can learn now that, I believe, and it seems like your testimony indicates that we're kind of approaching back to normal now? And we've seen in the crisis of 15 years ago, we saw what many people thought was an inadequate fiscal response, that the fiscal response was, less than half of the output gap. And we limited by political will to do things. And then, of course, you were limited by the zero bound in what you could do for most of a decade. And we had a long recovery. And the comparison, to the COVID recovery has been very sharp, and it's quite remarkably put us right back on that track. Are there any lessons that you've sort of drawn about the importance of the getting the right balance of fiscal and monetary response to these shocks?
So we think about that a lot, and I think I have to start by saying it's too soon to really tell, because the answers you would give today, the picture looks very different than what it looked like a year ago. And so, and a year from now, we'll be looking back going and saying, we've learned so much more. So I think the pandemic is still writing the story of our economy right now. And we should just be prepared to be surprised with the next chapter, as we were with 2023, the very strong growth, the sharp decline in inflation while the labor market remained very strong. Very few forecasters had that, but we can talk about it.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you for being here today and for your testimony. I'd like to start off, first of all, by completely echoing everything Congressman Barr said. A lot of us have talked about Basel III endgame, and I think Congressman Barr kind of nailed the thought process. I do hope you'll kind of withdraw that and take the comments you've heard from here and from so many others about the hazards with the current approach. But I'd also like to, address one of the other practices by the Federal Reserve. And it's the practice of paying interest on excess reserve balances held with the Fed accounts. It's my strong belief that rewarding banks with returns for taking no market risks actually harms our economy, and it discourages financial institutions from lending money into the economy. Instead, they park it at the Fed. This has little to no impact on very large corporations, but it can have a crippling impact on small and mid-market firms. And we especially saw this in the long recovery as Dodd-Frank was implemented in the Obama years, transition to the Trump years. We changed some of that mindset with a lot of other policies, but we saw a strong surging economy. So our country wouldn't pay a price for this market distortion by the Fed in two ways. First, they're unable to obtain loans at competitive rates because the money's sucked out of the market. Frankly, a lot of them don't even have access to lending except through bank capital. So it forces them into other forms of capital, equity capital, and others. Second, they ultimately pay higher rates whenever they have these alternative means of capital. And so today I've introduced a prohibition on the IOER Act, which would prohibit the Federal Reserve from paying interest on excess reserves. By eliminating IOER, we can begin to return our economy to the undistorted free market economy it's supposed to have. The alternative is you could simply raise requirements. We see some of those moral hazards when you do it across the board with approach like Basel. So what's your case for why you should keep paying interest on excess reserves?
Well, as you know, we don't see the downsides that you're talking about. Banks have a cost of funds and they have what they can earn, and that's what really matters is the spread.
And if they wanted to do it, they could simply buy treasuries on their own, and they could do that independently. I suppose they can independently keep it at the Fed, but they don't have to buy. They don't even have to put it on their own balance sheets in the same way. They've got immediate liquidity with Fed overnight account. So I don't see how that's different than what they could already do.
What I was going to say was, banks can earn a much bigger spread by lending to corporates. So their incentive to lend is the same as it always was. This doesn't affect that. Really, it's they have a cost of funds and they have the ability to have reserves, but that's not going to. They're not earning a profit on that. So, or a big one. They can earn a much bigger profit by lending to small corporates.
Well, speaking of profit, I mean, the Federal Reserve isn't officially supposed to be a for-profit corporation, but you are supposed to pay for your operating costs off of positive cash flow. And right now, the Fed doesn't have positive cash flow. In fact, the Fed has negative cash flow. So it's not entirely unrelated that the Federal Reserve operated at a $114.3 billion loss in 2023 and currently is carrying a $133 billion loss on its balance sheet this year. So it's, not the right approach, I think, to be paying essentially that much out in excess reserves to banks that are holding capital in the Fed when they could be deploying it into the market. So right now, the interest you're paying banks and money market funds exceeds the income you're getting on the $7.6 trillion balance sheet assets that you have, to the tune of $133 billion asset. So, effectively, the Fed is operating at an operating loss. So what's the path back to cash flow positivity for the Fed?
As you know, we've, for many years during the QE large balance sheet period, we've contributed way over $1 trillion in net earnings to the bank, which to the Treasury Department. So you can't look at the loss without mentioning that we've been, giving effectively $100 billion a year in profits every year to the Treasury Department. So the other side of that is when we raise rates to do the job you've assigned us to get inflation under control. When we do that, we absorb paper losses. It has no effect on our operating, the way we operate the Fed. And if we retained all the earnings we have, then it wouldn't be a problem. But we don't do that. We give that money to Treasury.
Thank you. And I think the last thing is I just encourage you to halt any effort to develop a central bank digital currency. It doesn't need designed, developed, and it certainly doesn't need established. I yield.
The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member, and thank you, Director Powell, for being here. Let me start by saying thank you for the monetary report. I've had a chance to try to peruse it, and there are headings in there that says the labor market remains strong. You'd probably agree to that, your report.
I would.
Let that say that's a yes. Also, it talks about unemployment rates being low by historical standards. You'd agree with that? It also states that the global pandemic played a huge role with the inflation rate, and inflation rates are on the decline. It's reported in several charts in here, and also substantiated by the Federal Reserve of New York and Michigan surveys that I've read. It also talks about job gains and uses the word robust jobs. So I want to thank you for educating us on that. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like the record to show that all of this also resulted during the Biden-Harris administration of making sure. So often we hear in this committee and other committees about what the administration is not doing and what our economy and jobs look like. Now let me move on to something that's very dear to me, and want to thank our ranking member for bringing it up, and that's the lack of affordable housing, which is one of the primary things that I hear about when I'm back home. I'm on more panels to try to explain what you do, what we do, or oftentimes what we don't do and why we have this. While I know that interest rate hikes have successfully brought down the inflation, rising rates have also had an adverse effect on the cost and the pace of housing construction and costs. Are you concerned about the effects that interest rate hikes are having on the cost of financing new construction? And the second part, how do you expect to control for long-term housing inflation that might have a potential rate cuts, how it might affect that?
So our policy to bring inflation down is to raise interest rates, and that works through several channels. One of them is probably the most important, is interest-sensitive spending, and within that you have housing and durable goods and things like that. So, you know, during the early days of the pandemic, the housing industry was about to all go bankrupt, and all of the facilities that we did really supported that industry through their critical time. When we're going in the other direction, when we're raising rates, housing is definitely affected. We understand that. It's not something we want to have happen, just it is the reality that housing will slow a lot when you raise interest rates. We've done that, and we're doing it for the longer run benefit of the people we serve to restore price stability, which is beyond value for people to have price stability. We get it that in the near term, that's higher rates, that's fewer sales, people are locked into low rate mortgages. We get all that, but we got to do this because it'll benefit the country and people in the longer run.
And I have a great appreciation for that. But also when I go back home to the district, what I hear a lot from agencies and individuals who work with advocacy groups, that the effects of interest rate hikes are not borne equally to all American households. So we hear that, and there's no doubt that low income and minority communities are hit the highest or the hardest by these monetary policy changes. Black households and business owners have historically faced challenges with home ownership and access to capital, and they're disproportionately impacted by the rate hikes. Does the Fed, do you have anything that you could help me with this dilemma and how we can better achieve economic goals in a more precise and equitable manner?
So I think it's working. You see inflation coming down, and that's why I do think it's likely at some time this year, if the economy, proceeds along the path we expect, that we will begin to reduce rates. So that's really the path that we're on, and I do hope it works out that way.
And when you say, I don't have a lot of time, but when you say economy, what does that mean? Helping poor people and Black people get more jobs, more money?
So our forecast is for continued strong growth, continued strong labor market, with, wages going up and also with inflation coming down. So that kind of an economy.
Okay, my time is up. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry and Ranking Member Waters for holding this hearing, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us today. I'd like to start by discussing the independent automated teller machine owners or operators section of the Bank Secrecy Act examination manual. I want to ensure that financial institutions will not be discouraged from providing banking services to the independently owned ATM industry. In 2021, you made it clear that the industry does not automatically present a higher risk for illicit finance. I'd like to know what efforts have been made by the Federal Reserve to fully communicate that position to financial institutions across the country.
I will have to get back to you on that one.
All right. Thank you. Well, and so I might just add, listening to independent ATM operators over the time that I've served in Congress, I've come to understand that unfortunately, and it was in the bank examiner's manual up until just about a couple years ago, these operators were identified as being extraordinarily risky, and that was causing them to be debanked in many cases. So I do hope that you'll take a look at that and make sure that we're communicating that to financial institutions and, most importantly, to the regulators. Chair Powell, Tennessee is home to over 1,000 foreign-based businesses that have chosen to invest in our state and create more than 160,000 jobs. These jobs are reliant upon cross-border financing provided by global banks, including foreign banking organizations. The Federal Reserve has long maintained the principles of national treatment and equality of competitive opportunity when regulating foreign banks and assessing them based on their U.S. operations. Are you still committed to these principles?
Yes.
And how will these principles be reflected as you move to finalize the Basel Endgame proposal?
So we have received a whole separate set of comments from the foreign banks, and we'll look at those, very much in that spirit and make appropriate changes.
Thank you. Chair Powell, the Basel III Endgame will incentivize firms to transfer credit risks off their balance sheets. One avenue for such a transfer is synthetic securitization, the framework of which must be approved by the Federal Reserve. However, it is my understanding that there is a substantial backlog of reviews and approvals of these securitization frameworks. It is concerning that the Federal Reserve is directing the risk transfer, yet also impeding it, in my view. Can you comment or can you commit to reviewing this approval process and taking steps to reduce the backlog of pending securitization applications?
So as I understand it, these transactions are becoming popular right now. There's a lot of appetite to do them, and we're not stopping them. We're just being careful because there were similar things that happened about credit risk transfer during the global financial crisis that didn't actually work out. So we want to make sure that these structures really do actually durably transfer. And we think that they do, but we just need to be careful because the last experience with these was difficult back in the last crisis. So it's just something that we're not intending to slow these down, and I think we'll try to get through it.
Is it a lack of available resources to apply to the approval process, or is it an intentional slow walking to make sure that every I is dotted, every T crossed?
I don't actually know, but I do. What I heard was, what I have been told is, we're not stopping these, but we're going to be careful with them and just be absolutely careful that they really do transfer credit risk in a durable, kind of sustained way. And that's the thing. And I don't think it's an intention to go slow or to have a backlog. It's just, and so I don't know what the staffing issue is. We'll check.
All right, thank you. As the Federal Reserve continues to consider proposals designed and debated in Europe, such as Basel III, has the Federal Reserve Supervisory Climate Committee or the Financial Stability Committee had any discussions regarding the adoption of ESG risks in capital requirements?
I don't know.
Has there been any discussion in other committees regarding the adoption of ESG risks in capital requirements?
Any discussion? I really don't know. Let me say that's not something we're considering, but when you ask me any discussion, I don't know.
It's not a priority. in
To
capital
put
requirements.
it mildly, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I see my time is running out. I appreciate your answers, and any further light you can shed on those matters, I'd appreciate. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here today. I want to start then just with following up on the exchange you had with Mr. Sherman. As I think you know, I led a letter with 106 of my colleagues with concerns about specifically the clean energy tax equity provisions in Basel. I appreciate your commitment to look at that. I wonder if I could just put a little bit of a sharper point on it. Can you look at that before the rule is finalized and potentially issue some sort of an addendum to the rule? The concern I have is the number of banks who are a little bit frozen right now, waiting for some clarity on that. And I'd prefer we not slow down the rate of clean energy investing in our country if we don't have to.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a proposal, and we're well aware of the commentary, and we're going to react appropriately. I don't know that we can pull one thing out of line and deal with it. But we're making good progress, and I think we'll be back reasonably soon with some answers.
Okay, well, time is of the essence. Appreciate anything you can do. Second thing, good thing about going late here, you get to follow up. I want to follow up on your discussion with Congresswoman Garcia here. I really appreciated your comments in the 60 Minutes interview last month when you mentioned that immigration is a big part of the story of the labor market coming back into balance. Now, generally, and correct me if I'm wrong, more immigration is generally going to ease inflationary pressure. Is that all else equal? Is that a safe characterization?
It's probably closer to neutral, actually, because people come in, they also spend, so it's not clear that immigrants coming in, they add to GDP.
Okay, so either we're going to get economic growth and or downward pressure on wages.
More workers, so that wages might go up a little bit less, but at the same time, they're also spending. So we had this conversation. It depends on what you assume, but I think it's better to just assume it's sort of broadly neutral from an inflation standpoint.
So I guess, and maybe you've answered the second question, but given as you all are using the Census Bureau data that is more conservative than the CBO data, and obviously we're all making estimates in the future, can you speak at all to whether your forward views on economic growth and inflation, how sensitive are they to your assumptions about that census versus CBO data on what the actual level of immigration is to the country right now?
I think the CBO assumptions are meaningfully higher and would affect growth and would be part of the explanation why growth was strong last year and would be a reason to expect. I mean, it's not the main reason, but it would definitely add to growth this year. And I wouldn't say that we accept one version or the other. We study the CBO numbers carefully. We're just trying to get to the right answer. And but I mean, I think the CBO shows, and they say so, stronger growth, higher growth, more people. I don't know the per capita growth goes up, but the absolute level of growth goes up.
Okay. Last question. I think there's a lot of good news in the monetary report that you all just issued around wage growth. We've seen, the lower quartile of earners starting to close some of those historic gaps. We've seen minority groups and women start to close some of those gaps. What I didn't see, and I don't know if this is because you all haven't done it or I just didn't read closely enough. Have you seen any gaps regionally within the U.S.? Are there parts of the country that are seeing stronger wage growth than others?
There are. I don't have that off the top of my head. I want to go back and if I can when I talked about immigration, I think that the immigration story for last year was part of the positive supply shock and was part of the reason why inflation came down. I was really asking the question over the longer run.
Fair enough.
And there, I think it's more being neutral.
I appreciate that. I want to just close on this regional piece because the Atlanta Fed, which is the best I could find that looks to do at least some by census regions, that as I look through, there's and you look at which regions are consistently running above. I think that New England and the West are consistently showing wage increase above average. And the West, South, Central, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana are consistently, I think going back to like July of 2022, consistently seeing wage growth below average. And I appreciate you're not going to wade into a political question here, but those are all right to work states where it's harder to unionize, where it's harder to organize. And what I'm wondering is, without asking you to opine on policy, have you all at the Fed done any analysis that says, as we look at when there are gains in labor productivity, does that gain in labor productivity, is it more likely to accrue to workers in those states where there's a stronger union presence, easier to organize, and more bargaining power for labor as opposed to capital?
My guess is there's plenty of research around that area, not necessarily at the Fed, but we'll take a look and come back to you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now go to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here today. We continue to appreciate your work and the work of the Federal Reserve on behalf of the American people. In August of 2023, the Federal Reserve, FDIC, and OCC released the NPR requiring the issuance of long-term debt for Category 2, 3, and 4 banks. As you may know, I, along with many of my colleagues, authored a letter to each agency expressing concerns regarding the lack of tailoring in the proposal and shortcomings in estimating the actual cost of the proposed rules. I'm concerned that these shortfalls will negatively impact lending in my district, and when combined with the other ongoing regulatory proposals, could cause further consolidation of the banking industry. It appears that the Federal Reserve has primarily deferred to the FDIC concerning the proposal. Could you shed light on the Federal Reserve's role within the rulemaking process concerning the long-term debt proposal? And have you provided input regarding the proposal's interplay with Basel III Endgame?
You know, I think we're one of the proposers of the rule, just like the other agencies are. And, you know, right now we're looking at the comments that we've gotten. That comment period, I believe, has closed. Yeah. And so we're very much in reading those comments as the law.
You're in the middle of it, fair to say. Okay, thank you. I'm concerned that the long-term debt proposal's lack of tailoring contradicts the statutory requirements of the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. Instead of applying tailoring principles, this proposal creates Category 2, 3, and 4 financial institutions identically for the purposes of long-term debt issuances. Additionally, the proposal unduly burdens Category 2, 3, and 4 banks by requiring them to issue long-term debt at both the parent holding company and bank level, which actually could be viewed as reverse tailoring, considering GSIBs are only required to issue debt at the parent company level. What is the underlying rationale behind this dual requirement, particularly when such a mandate is not imposed on our largest banks? And do you believe that this represents a tailored approach as required by the statute?
So that tailoring question is one of the questions we'll be asking ourselves as part of our review of the comments.
Thank you. It's my understanding that Category 4 banks were not included in the original advance notice of proposed rulemaking for the long-term debt rule released in the fall of 2022. Is that your understanding as well?
I didn't catch that.
Did the advance notice that was released in the fall of 22 include Category 4 banks? It's my understanding that it did not.
I can't confirm that, to be honest.
Well, I think that's something that you should take into account because the Category 2 and 3 banks have had an additional year to foresee this challenge. And so Category 4 banks are really behind the 8 ball. And yeah, so I guess my next question is, do you believe regulatory agencies should provide smaller regional banks longer than the 3-year phase-in period to meet any final long-term debt requirements?
It's a good question. That's one of the comments we've gotten, and we'll be looking at that.
I appreciate it. I just think if we're going to impose these new regulations, giving everyone the same opportunity to comply with them is something worth considering. I guess one final question. If these proposed regulatory changes had been in effect prior to the fall of SVB and Signature, do you believe the outcome would have been different? Because honestly, I don't think anything would have changed.
You know, it's hypothetical. I'm tempted to say that if there had been more long-term debt there that was specifically there to absorb losses.
They were nowhere near being solvent, but I guess that's something I think y'all should take into account, whether if these proposed changes to our system that are designed to make it more resilient would have actually caused SVB and Signature to have a different outcome. Because again, it just seems that my colleagues across the aisle let no crisis go to waste. And these are changes that would not have, in fact, prevented the calamity that they are justifying the changes based on. Thank you for being here today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thanks. Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Due to the Fed's aggressive interest rate hikes, mortgage rates have surpassed 7%. rising to 20-year highs, leaving many credit-worthy and mortgage-ready homebuyers without a path to homeownership. This is a problem for everyone. It's an urban issue, it's a suburban issue, it's a rural issue. Chairman Powell, I welcome the decision of the Fed to pause rates at the end of last year. But for families in my district and across the country, that is not enough. We need the Fed to start cutting because, like the rent, interest rates are too damn high. Chairman Powell, you've previously indicated that the Fed may cut rates this year. What would you expect the impact of lowering interest rates to be on the housing market specifically, including the rental, purchase, and construction market?
So we know that higher rates, of course, have slowed down the rate of activity. So if at such time as we start to lower interest rates, housing market will pick up broadly across new home construction and new home sales. The number, as you know, many households are in very low rate mortgages and they really can't sell because they have to refinance into a high rate mortgage. That'll go away over time. So ideally, the housing market would go back into a more normal phase, but one with lower inflation in the broader economy.
All right, so just to further reiterate that, interest rate cuts would have a great benefit. Just yesterday, actually, I met with a number of representatives from state housing finance agencies from throughout the country, and they were talking about the barriers to affordable housing projects given the current interest rate environment. Obviously, higher interest rates have raised costs for affordable housing developers, and many of them have chosen to slow down or halt construction entirely. So fewer homes are being built, which means fewer people are being housed. So given that we already, would you agree? So given that we already had a massive shortage of affordable housing supply prior to the pandemic, when interest rates were below 2%, the current rate, 5.5% rate, has been devastating. And the price of homes across the country have remained stubbornly high. It's clear that the current state of our housing market is impacting everyone and disproportionately hurting those who need stability the most. Does this concern you?
So our job is to do price stability and maximum employment. We don't target the housing market. And we're doing our jobs. That's what we're doing. It's not something we want to see, but
does this impact on the housing market? But does it concern you, Chairman Powell?
Does it concern me?
Yes, fewer homes are being built, so fewer people are being housed.
This is the job we've taken on.
All right, well, it concerns me greatly. Chairman Powell, the Fed's interest rate hikes have not been sufficient in addressing housing inflation. Do you agree that we need a more robust fiscal response to increase the supply of affordable housing and to lower costs nationwide?
So we don't take opinions. We don't express opinions on things like that. I will say that there is a structural housing shortage in the United States, and that's really the longer run problem. The problem with high interest rates is a short run problem. The longer run problem is lack of supply.
Well, that's why it is critical that Congress pass legislation and appropriation bills that will make those necessary investments in housing for all. Given the way that Ranking Member Waters fought for a $150 billion investment in housing and Build Back Better, I know on this side of the aisle that my colleagues and I are ready and waiting for the Republican majority to take housing inflation seriously. Housing affordability is the #1 issue I'm hearing about from my constituents. Families in my district and throughout this country need relief now. I truly hope the Fed will listen to them and cut interest rates. Thank you. I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norm, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. I think other people have noted about the crisis in the office building market across this country. That's a line of work we're in. I can tell you it's real. I can tell you the buildings that are effectively vacant, it's going to have an effect on the taxes paid. It's going to have an effect on rents. As far as affordability in housing, the rates are one thing, but my good friends on the other side of the aisle don't realize that housing has got over 200 components to it. One of the biggest is gas prices. And as long as we're buying gas from countries that hate America and don't manufacture our own, housing isn't coming down. I don't know how you define affordable anyway. It's going to continue a downward slide. And I'm from a state in South Carolina that people are moving in. And we're not going to have the housing starts that we should have because of the policies of the Biden administration, which is train wrecking this entire economy. On regulations, on Regulation 2, which is has the guardrails for credit card fees, how do you answer and I know the caps you're looking at adjusting that. How do you answer the charge that this is really should not be, you're getting in the way of banks charging fees according to what their costs are? How does the regulations affect that, particular Regulation 2?
Is this a Fed regulation we're talking about, or is
Yes,
this a CFPB regulation?
No, this is, for my record, it's the Federal Reserve has finalized the routing and restrictions and proposed tighter and adjusting the price caps that currently exist. Is that not right?
It doesn't ring a bell with me. It may well be right. I'm not
If
familiar.
you could look at that, I know all the credit unions and banks have got some concerns on that.
I will come back to you on that.
Okay, I appreciate it. Do you need a letter from us? Or
No, we'll come back to you.
Okay, thank you. CRA, for those of us who have been involved with banking for a long time, the regulations having a clear set of standards that we abide by and know where to put the money to. When should we have regulations out that we can read about what's going to be acceptable and what's not?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
The regulations on the changes in regulations for CRA.
Right. What about it? I'm sorry, I missed your question.
When are the regulations going to be out that we'll know, the banks will know what's acceptable for CRA and what's not acceptable?
So the final rule, of course, is out. I think we're working on, there's a lot of work to do. The requirements don't really kick in, most of them for a couple of years at least. So I think we're working on the follow-up regulations.
Okay, that's really important for all the banks because they want to make sure they qualify, and where the dollars are spent, they need to make sure that it's going at the right spot because the credits won't be applied unless that's it. The Fed now, where the Federal, I think, Reserve launched and is operating this now. How is the participation rate going with that?
Slow, real slow. It's early days. There are network effects. These things they go slow until they don't. And it was the same way with ACH. You may remember back in the day.
Right.
So we're at fewer than 500 banks are in there now. We're working away at it. We expect it'll take some time, but but it's there, and we think it'll be beneficial. We had a lot of support from smaller banks to build it, as you know.
Is the pricing below cost?
I don't believe so. No, not longer run cost.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you for being here.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for this hearing, and to you, Chair Powell, for appearing before the committee to discuss the recently published monetary policy report. As we continue our work on behalf of the American people, we have to keep in mind that our mission here is to grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. It seems as if there has been a constant series of shocks to the economy, both domestically and globally, and yet we can all see just how resilient the labor market has been as it has maintained its strength. With a robust gain of 353,000 jobs, the January numbers are a continuation of the trend that Democrats in Congress delivered through historic investments in our workforce, putting people over politics. In light of this relative economic strength, I really want to implore the Federal Reserve to take stock of the holistic economic picture before making decisions on monetary policy, and to pay particular attention to those communities that have been historically left behind during times of accelerated recovery. I want to add to the questions from my colleague, Congresswoman Presley, Chair Powell. At a time where it has become increasingly difficult for working people and people of color in particular to purchase a home, I worry.
Silver Gold Patrimonio nace en 2018 con el objetivo de innovar en el mercado de los metales preciosos de inversión, ofreciendo nuevas alternativas para que cualquier persona, familia o empresa pueda entrar en el fantástico mundo de los metales de inversión de forma sencilla y acompañada por consultores expertos en el sector. Silver Gold Patrimonio quiere avanzar contigo.
No puede volver atrás y cambiar el principio, pero puede comenzar donde está y cambiar el final. En Luna Sevilla queremos ser su asesor financiero de referencia para mejorar su presente y su futuro patrimonial, prestando nuestros servicios como agentes de Caser Asesores Financieros. Somos una empresa con una clara apuesta por la formación de calidad, la información transparente y objetiva, y por el asesoramiento financiero personalizado y continuado. Visite nuestra web lunasevilla.es o llame al 91 762 3442.
¿Se puede poner a prueba vuestra tecnología de trading? Sí. ¿Y vuestra ejecución funciona al milisegundo? Sí. ¿Y vuestros spreads están entre los más bajos del mercado, no? Si quiere, puede probar nuestra primera vez. Es difícil encontrar un broker que cumpla con todas sus expectativas. O quizá no tanto. Active Trades, broker online desde 2001.
Effects to end users, which are all of our constituents who are looking to see these costs come down. Let me shift. This Congress, under the leadership of Ranking Member Waters and former CBC Chair Joyce Beatty, I've made it a focus of my efforts to educate my colleagues and the public at large on the far-reaching benefits of increased diversity in the workplace, in our boardrooms, and in society as a whole. Despite the efforts by some on the other side to take away the very tools of economic opportunity that create inclusive work environments and improve performance, there has been a really misguided assault on everything from diversity, equity, and inclusion to other programs following the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling on affirmative action. So Chairman Powell, as you know, your Office of Minority and Women Inclusion has a focus on this. So as we anticipate the upcoming release of your annual report on inclusion, would you be able to speak to the necessity of collecting this data that minority and women-owned businesses are included in the board's contracting and acquisition opportunities?
I do believe we collect that data and we monitor that very carefully.
And why is it important?
Well, I think diversity in the workplace is an important thing, and you won't know how you're doing unless you measure it.
And just as the McKinsey Institute released in their Diversity Matters Even More report, companies that have more diverse management teams actually outperform companies that don't. That goes to the bottom line of our economy, and I wish my colleagues on the other side would stop their assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion and actually work with us to grow the economy.
Gentleman's time
for
has
everyone.
expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stiles, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, Chairman Powell. Appreciate it. You're navigating a difficult situation where we've had stimulative economic policies from the Biden administration, in particular, excessive government spending, investment in infrastructure, specific tax credits. At the same time, we're seeing a regulatory environment from the administration that's also restricting economic growth. We've heard a lot about the Basel III endgame, which you have a chair of. In your opening remarks, you noted that high interest rates are impacting business investment in a negative way. High interest rates are also negatively impacting the housing market. As we look at Basel III endgame, I've heard from a wide array of stakeholders, from those that are commenting on increase in bank capital standards, the negative impact that would have on the housing market, as well as from the business community, the impact that would have on their ability to invest in capital infrastructure and increase employment. Does the broad diversity of voices who hold concerns on the Basel III endgame concern you?
I would say that I've articulated concerns, and we're reading those comments, and we're very much in the process of assessing what we need to do to address them.
Thank you. And appreciate your time on that. Shifting gears slightly, as you may know, the Securities and Exchange Commission held an open meeting today to approve the final climate change rule. It's a significant regulation that I think would have a significant impact on the economy. Can you comment how the Fed thinks about the economic impact of this new regulation or regulations more broadly, and in particular their impact on both inflation and on employment?
We don't comment on regulations of other agencies, sorry.
And you'll review that if it's put in place, or you'll review the economic impact as the empirical data comes forward?
We're not in the business of scoring, or, I mean, CBO does that. They'll look at this and make a careful assessment of the economic impacts and budgetary impacts and that kind of thing.
Thank you. I'll shift gears again. One of your two mandates is to maximize employment in addition to maintaining price stability. And as you know, government hiring has accounted for a large share of total job creation. More than 600,000 public sector jobs were created last year, and the federal government now employs nearly 3 million workers. So when you're examining employment data, how does the Fed view the impact of the public sector employment growth relative to private sector economic growth? In other words, how do the two data points factor into your assessment of how the broader economy is performing?
So the jobs are jobs, right? But I think we would tend to look at private sector jobs to get a better assessment. Private sector job creation is a better indicator of kind of the private sector momentum in the economy. But we look at both. I mean, they both count.
And does the dramatic increase in the private sector number of jobs give you any pause or concern as it relates to?
You mean in the public sector?
In the public sector. Sorry if I misspoke. Yes, the public sector.
The truth is the public sector was unable to hire at the beginning because wages went up a lot in the private sector at the beginning of the pandemic inflation, and public sector can't respond to that. So there's some catch-up hiring going on there now. Now that things are settling down to normal, I think there's some catch-up hiring. I'm not sure it's an issue we're concerned about.
Okay, I'll shift gears in my final minute just to talk a little bit to get your perspective on the macroeconomic developments that are having an impact on our monetary policy, specifically as we think about the potential for a productivity boom, from AI to work at home to other factors. The data is probably too early to tell whether or not we're having a true productivity view, but how does the Fed view the adoption of some of these new technologies, in particular AI, as it relates to labor productivity?
So everyone's looking at AI for that question, and it's hard to say, actually. We've had really nice productivity in the last year or so, but it's probably still very much affected by the post-pandemic factors that we're seeing. I think we need to see more to understand whether there is a longer-term boom. AI certainly has the capacity to either augment labor or to replace labor, and that's a key question. We really don't know which of the two it will do. Tons of money being invested in it, and so it's likely to drive significant productivity. I would say right now, technology, but also higher labor mobility. A lot of people quitting during the really tight labor market, and also the rise in startups. There were a lot of people started companies during the pandemic. Those are the kind of things that do add up to higher productivity over time. So there is hope that we'll see some productivity out of this.
Thanks for your comments today, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go to the last questioner of the day, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have several questions about some of the most common complaints that I've heard about Basel III Endgame. I have an open mind on the subject, but I want to hear your response to some of the arguments that have been leveled against it. First, the Fed has repeatedly reassured the public that the banking system is well capitalized. Yet the Fed is advancing Basel III on the assumption that the banking system is undercapitalized. So the first question is, how do you reconcile the Fed's repeat assurances about a well-capitalized banking system with Basel III's assumption of an undercapitalized banking system? The second question, if the purpose of Basel III is to
Silver Gold Patrimonio nace en 2018 con el objetivo de innovar en el mercado de los metales preciosos de inversión, ofreciendo nuevas alternativas para que cualquier persona, familia o empresa pueda entrar en el fantástico mundo de los metales de inversión de forma sencilla y acompañada por consultores expertos en el sector. Silver Gold Patrimonio quiere avanzar contigo.
Ya sé que los premios no lo son todo, pero cuando veo un espacio lleno de ellos, impresiona. A menudo los premios dicen mucho de una persona. Pasión, compromiso. Siempre que no sea un trofeo cualquiera que algunos exhiben en su despacho. Es difícil encontrar un broker que cumpla con todas sus expectativas. O quizá no tanto. Active Trades, broker online desde 2001.
Dicen que el tiempo lo cura todo, pero los inversores en bonos que se han visto perjudicados por la compra de Credit Suisse pueden necesitar más que unos meses antes de estar dispuestos a lanzarse a por los bonos de capital adicional Tier 1, los AT1, que el VS espera todavía colocar en el mercado. Es fácil entender por qué los inversores en deuda subordinada pueden mostrar cautela, porque recibieron un duro golpe cuando el banco suizo aceptó hacerse cargo de su rival en quiebra en marzo. Títulos con un valor nominal de 17.000 millones de dólares que desaparecieron de un día para otro. Y lo que es peor, fueron borrados a pesar de que los accionistas consiguieron retener algo de valor, en un extraordinario vuelco de la jerarquía tradicional del capital. Los bonos AT1, los convertibles contingentes, los cocos, se crearon a raíz de la crisis financiera de 2008. Era una forma en la que los bancos que colapsaran absorbieran las pérdidas, lo que hacía menos probable un rescate financiado por el contribuyente. Apuesta arriesgada, porque si un prestamista se mete en problemas, esta clase de bonos se pueden convertir rápidamente en capital o amortizarse por completo. Son de mayor riesgo y por eso ofrecen un mayor rendimiento que la mayoría de los emitidos con calificaciones crediticias similares, lo que los hace populares, sobre todo entre los que tienen dinero, los clientes institucionales. Por lo general, los tenedores de bonos, en el orden jerárquico, están arriba. Cuando un banco colapsa, los accionistas son los primeros que pierden, pero debido al cambio de las normas, por el caso Credit Suisse, ya nada está sobre seguro.
Market rate risk and operational risk. What is your response to the criticism that the Fed should focus its energies on addressing the forms of risk that were responsible for the SVB bank failure rather than focusing on forms of risk that were largely unrelated to it?
So I agree with that, but I would say we are working on a package of liquidity measures, which directly addresses the Silicon Valley Bank situation. We've also taken a lot of supervisory actions with other medium and small sized banks that had a lot of uninsured deposits and a lot of real estate risk and things like that. So we've been doing quite a lot on the supervisory section that it doesn't require new rules.
And then finally, as you know, the crippling cost of housing accounts for a third of inflation. One of the most powerful tools for producing and preserving affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit, which has financed nearly 4 million units of affordable housing. The banking system accounts for 85% of LIHTC investments. And there's a concern that Basel III in its present form would diminish the availability of LIHTC and the amount of affordable housing development. And so I'm just curious, is that on your radar and is that something you're willing to examine?
Yes, it is.
So with that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. That's the final questioning of the day. We committed to the chair that would be done with a hard stop by 1 p.m. It's nice when we can honor our commitments. So I'd like to thank Chair Powell for his testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days in which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair. The questions will be forwarded to the witness for his response. I ask you, Chair Powell, please respond as promptly as you possibly can. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.
¿Las soluciones de inversión tradicionales ya no cumplen con sus objetivos financieros? ¿La escasa rentabilidad y la volatilidad de los mercados le empujan a mantener los ahorros en su cuenta corriente? Si la respuesta a ambas preguntas es afirmativa, lo más probable es que esté pensando que la opción de no invertir es la óptima. Esta alternativa es quizás la más inmediata, pero ciertamente no parece la más rentable. Nuestros productos de generación de rentas están diseñados para ofrecerle el equilibrio adecuado entre seguridad y rentabilidad, con el fin de aprovechar todas las oportunidades del mercado.
hemos revisado nuestro enfoque tradicional, ampliando el espectro de oportunidades dentro del segmento de rentas para una inversión que le prepare mejor para el futuro. Y con la integración de los principios ESG, podemos ayudar a construir un futuro más verde para todos los inversores que buscan rentabilidad. No se conforme con la liquidez. Prepárese para el futuro con fondos de Invesco. Descubra más en invesco.es/income.
Localizarnos ahora es más fácil. La economía a tu alcance. Empresas, inversiones, tecnología. Ya en la APP de Movistar. Vive la economía. Negocios Televisión. Localizarnos ahora es más fácil. La economía a tu alcance. Empresas, inversiones, tecnología. Ya en la APP de Movistar. Vive la economía. Negocios Televisión.
Bienvenidos a Líderes, otro programa más donde pues hablamos de esas cosas que no se hablan en los medios, pero que pensamos que es lo importante, pues el empleo, el crecimiento empresarial, la productividad, los salarios. Hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial que me hace mucha ilusión entrevistar. Bueno, hoy tenemos a Daniel Lacalle, ¿no? Siempre hemos estado discutiendo y en debates y hoy te voy a entrevistar, Daniel, me hace mucha ilusión y quiero entrevistar al líder, ¿no? Tú eres un líder social, pero también eres un líder financiero, empresarial y quiero conocer a la persona y que les conozcamos un poco más, ¿no? Bienvenido.
Muchísimas gracias, es un gustazo estar aquí, claro que sí.
Oye, bueno, ya lo hemos hablado muchas veces, pero tienes muchas cosas interesantes, ¿no? Porque eres un personaje muy interesante. Tienes una que a mí siempre me ha admirado, ¿no? Tú, o sea, tu abuelo era ministro de Franco, tu padre era amigo de Carrillo y eurocomunista y tú sales liberal, ¿no? Claro, ni Franco ni el comunismo era liberal. Entonces, ¿cómo sale Daniel Lacalle liberal? ¿Por qué eres liberal?
Bueno, pues fíjate qué curioso es, porque la verdad es que curioso es. Lo primero que yo me gustaría agradecer siempre de mi familia ha sido la apertura y la facilidad para pensar las cosas por ti mismo sin dogmatismos, ¿no? Y yo siempre digo que mi abuelo y mi padre son el espíritu del 78, porque mi abuelo y mi padre se llevaban maravillosamente, ¿sabes? Mi padre estuvo en la cárcel en la época de Franco, porque además, bueno es Lacalle, ¿no? Mi padre se negó a que le hicieran favores por ser hijo de ministro y mi abuelo se negó a que le hicieran favores por ser ministro, ¿verdad? Entonces, bueno, pues mi padre luchaba contra la dictadura mirando hacia lo opuesto, que era otra dictadura, la comunista. Y mi abuelo, pues mi abuelo era un militar que lo que quería era lo mejor para el ejército del aire, etcétera, etcétera. Pero lo interesante de todo ese proceso es que en todos esos debates y en todas esas cosas que yo escuchaba constantemente, a mí siempre me chirriaba esa deificación del Estado, fuese vía el comunismo porque claro, el comunismo te vende la idea de que el marxismo defiende que no hace falta un Estado, pero es mentira, claro, porque lo que hace siempre es generar una...
Bueno, ellos crearon un Estado un poco más intenso.
Eso es, claro. Entonces, ¿qué es
Su
lo que...
superestructura era mucho más intensa.
Claro, entonces, ¿qué era lo que pasaba? Pues que a mí me chirriaba constantemente que todo lo que parecía absolutamente evidente, la solución fuese mucho más control estatal y mucho más control por parte de una serie de líderes mesiánicos que decidiesen todo, ¿no? Porque entonces, no lo veía por ningún lado y la verdad, oye, sus buenas discusiones, cuando yo era un chavalín en casa, además.
Ya eras igual de inquieto y de...
Sí, porque yo empecé a ser, porque además, ¿qué es lo que pasa? Pues nos fuimos a vivir a Inglaterra siendo muy pequeño. Claro, yo vivía en Inglaterra y yo veía desde pequeño, yo veía en la televisión, yo vivía el invierno del descontento, el avance de Margaret Thatcher, el cambio de una Inglaterra que era un erial de control estatal por todos los lados, etcétera, etcétera. Y yo decía... hombre, no eres un analista económico ni un político.
Tendrías igual que yo 8 o 9 años.
Claro, pero tú piensas cómo te afecta cuando tienes 8 o 9 años y hay cosas como que esta semana te vas a bañar el lunes y el miércoles, ¿sabes? O está
por la crisis del petróleo en el 79.
Todas las calles, yo vivía en la zona de Nap Hill, etcétera, todo aquello, y te encuentras las basuras por todos los lados, etcétera, etcétera, todo eso. Entonces, 8 o 9, a mí me gustaba mucho la música, entonces yo iba viendo con la música y con la realidad, pues que iba confrontando lo que iba pasando, ¿no? Y a los 14 años más o menos, yo recibo ya, digamos, el shock cultural más importante. Y es que nos invitan a pasar un verano en un campamento en la Alemania comunista. Un programa para vender la Alemania comunista a los pobres capitalistas que vivían tan mal y que estaba todo tan mal. Y voy yo con un primo mío y veo de primera mano lo que es la propaganda, la represión y la miseria más absoluta. Y yo, yendo a un sitio en el que además venían a vendernos lo bien que iba todo, es decir, nos intentaban enseñar todas las bondades de la Alemania comunista, volví de ese campamento diciendo yo cualquier cosa excepto eso y excepto España, porque claro, cuando yo era un chaval, veníamos de Inglaterra a España.
Y todo estaba prohibido.
Y de verdad que se notaba, ¿Tú sabes en qué lo notaba yo? Yo lo notaba en la música, lo notaba en el cine, ¿no? Porque a mí me gusta mucho el cine, me gusta muchísimo la música, como tú sabes, y yo eso lo notaba mucho. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que pasa? Pues es un proceso básicamente desde los 12 años hasta los 18, en el que por eliminación me voy dando cuenta de que no quiero absolutamente nada, ni con el control mesiánico estatal, ni de derechas, ni de izquierdas, ni de nada, y ves además que ¿dónde te gustaría vivir? ¿Dónde te gustaría trabajar? ¿No? Me gustaría, claro, ¿dónde le gustaría a usted vivir? A mí en Reino Unido, a mí en Estados Unidos, etcétera, etcétera. Ya, bomba total, después de haber vivido eso, me voy a Estados Unidos. Y voy a Estados Unidos y digo, señores,
este es mi sitio.
Aquí estamos. Hemos llegado. Hemos llegado y claro, pues es un proceso en el que paso completamente de promesas estatales, ¿no?
Oye, ¿y cómo llegas a estudiar negocios? Porque tampoco había tradición familiar, ¿no?
Ninguna.
Y finanzas, ¿no? Y te conviertes en un financiero tan exitoso.
Bueno, ninguna tradición, de hecho. Familia de ingenieros o militares, ¿no? Mi padre ingeniero aeronáutico y a mí me gustaba la economía. me gustaba la economía, pero no tanto la economía de las últimas páginas del País, que era aquellas, ¿te acuerdas que salía las 4 cosas? Sino la economía de empresa, la empresa, no sé, me parecía increíble. Bueno, estaban en aquella época creciendo las empresas españolas muchísimo en el extranjero, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, me interesaba la empresa. Y entonces dije, quiero hacer empresariales. Bastante debate hubo en casa con el tema, ¿sabes?
Querían que fueras
Querían
ingeniero.
que fuera ingeniero. Esto es lo típico de la familia de
Sí, sí,
España. Querían, entonces, yo quise y me emperré y lo hice. Y lo hice. Entonces, en empresariales, la verdad es que tuve la enorme suerte de tener a varios profesores que me dieron una visión absolutamente espectacular del mundo y sobre todo hacia afuera, ¿no? Y me quiero acordar en particular de uno que luego se convirtió en amigo mío, que en paz descanse, Emilio Ontiveros, que ha sido para mí pues un amigo de verdad, de estas personas que realmente inspiradoras, ¿no? Entonces, fue por eso, a mí me gustaba mucho el tema de las empresas. Entendía que las empresas eran lo que generaba la diferencia, ¿no? Yo me acuerdo estar en Los Ángeles e ir pasando por la carretera que te lleva desde el LAX hacia el centro, ir viendo a un lado y al otro esos grandísimos edificios y decir, joder, es que esto es lo que realmente es lo que merece la pena. Y todo, claro, obviamente, pues desde muy naif o a lo mejor poco desarrollado, pero eso es lo que me gustaba, ¿no?
Y sales de la universidad ya, ¿no? Enfilado y entras muy rápido al sector financiero, ¿o tienes alguna experiencia antes?
No, yo empecé sí en el sector financiero, pero no
desde el lado de la empresa.
Desde el lado de la empresa. Yo entro, salgo de la carrera, tengo la enorme suerte, porque cuando yo termino la carrera, en España hay un 23% de paro. Yo tengo la enorme suerte de ser bilingüe.
No había ni telepizza, ¿te acuerdas?
Bueno, te va a haber telepizza, no había
Ahora dice, no, es que estamos mal. Digo, bueno,
no había nada, no había nada. Y además era paro de que cuando te vas al paro, te vas al paro.
Sí, registrado.
Entonces, me acuerdo que tuve la enorme suerte, por ser bilingüe y por tener la experiencia internacional, tuve la enorme suerte de entrar en Repsol, en aquella época se llamaba en Petrol todavía, para que flipes, en la parte de financiación internacional, que era el principio del principio del principio. Emitimos la primera emisión de papel comercial de la historia de España, fue estando yo allí.
En mercados internacionales.
En mercados internacionales.
¿En qué año?
Pues fíjate, estamos hablando del año 92. 92.
Sí, sí. Empezaba el Tesoro también a emitir, ¿no?
Entonces,
los bonos matadores, ¿no?
Otra de las personas que han sido para mí como pues, un mentor, ¿no? El director financiero de Repsol de aquella época, Carmelo de las Morenas, Óscar Fanjul, que era presidente en aquella época, que convirtió a Petrol en Repsol. Todas aquellas personas que tuve la enorme suerte de entrar directamente, aunque era un chavalín, alrededor de la gente que mandaba y que además estaba llevando a la empresa de ser local a internacional, ¿no? Y en la parte, imagínate, con los bancos de inversión, con los inversores, todo eso, tal cual, y a mí eso me encantaba. Tuve entonces la oportunidad de dedicarme durante un tiempo a exportación en Oriente Medio y África, y eso para mí fue una experiencia impresionante. En la época en la que todos estaban en guerra, yo iba por ahí con mercenarios como guardaespaldas.
Pero estabas en Repsol todavía.
Estaba en Repsol todavía, etcétera, etcétera. Y entonces me sale una oportunidad, yo estuve casi 10 años en Repsol, estoy en presidencia con Cortina, en relaciones con inversores, con Jorge Segreyes, con toda esta gente, con Ramón Blanco y antes con Fanjul y todos. Y lo bueno que fue es que con toda esa gente iba generando buenas amistades. Y me salió una oportunidad estando en Enagas, porque yo me fui de Repsol a Enagas y estuve allí con otro mentor mío, con Antonio González Alid, una persona maravillosa, y allí me salió una oportunidad para irme a la City. Y entonces, imagínate, ¿vale? Con 3 niños recién nacidos, tengo trillizos, con una carrera ya hecha, coche oficial no, coche de empresa, una dirección con gente trabajando para ti, tal cual, no sé qué, no sé cuántos, y coge, ¡bum! Y hago un giro de 180 grados porque era lo que quería, gracias, entre otras cosas, a una pareja, mi mujer, Patricia, que estaba completamente orientada al mismo objetivo, ¿no? Y entonces me sale esa oportunidad para irme a un banco de inversión como analista del sector energético, y muy poco tiempo después de estar como analista me llaman de Citadel, del mayor hedge fund del mundo. Claro, yo dije, bueno, pues vamos a hacer las entrevistas, vamos a ver, tal cual, no sé qué, no sé cuántos. Cuento en mi libro, Nosotros los mercados, lo que fue todo aquel proceso y me ficharon. Y entonces, ahí, a partir de ahí, estuve en inversión, como inversor, primero en Citadel, después en Ecofin, después en PIMCO y ahora en Teresis. Y una vez que miré al mundo financiero, o sea, siempre me gustó desde el mundo empresarial, pero una vez que llegué, ya no quise volver para atrás.
Oye, vamos a hacer una pausa, Daniel, porque vamos a empezar ya a hablar, cómo ves ahora desde ese lado que nos has contado, ¿no? Y vamos a hablar de la economía española y un poco de lo que hablamos en el programa y volvemos enseguida. Gracias.
El endeudamiento a nivel global es uno de los principales problemas a tener en cuenta en este año 2024. Así nos lo comentaba Steve Ellis, máximo responsable de renta fija global de Fidelity International, en nuestro evento de perspectivas para este año 2024.
The era of going back to zero interest rates is over, but my concern is that there's a huge amount of debt outstanding in the global economy. If inflation's in the system, only way in which you can refinance is to keep interest rates very low and keep real yields very low. The good thing about fixed income right now, I think, is that you're kind of getting potential equity-like returns with hopefully, lower volatility, bond volatility.
Pese a las incertidumbres que se nos plantean en el mercado de deuda, ¿qué oportunidades vemos para el inversor en renta fija?
Just a case of being safe and just locking into those decent yields that we're getting right now. My philosophy right now is to keep it simple and keep it safe. So I would think the best opportunities lie in front-end duration, so meaning 2 to 5 year segment of the curve, right? So I would think you just want to play it safe, just keep it simple, keep it in investment-grade credit, and keep it in the sort of short-end 2 to 5 year area.
En resumen, ante la volatilidad implícita que tendrán los mercados financieros por las incertidumbres macroeconómicas, desde Fidelity apostamos en renta fija por el grado de inversión europeo a corto plazo.
Bueno, Dani, con toda esa carrera tan exitosa, yo tengo una motivación en este programa y una misión, ¿no? Que es dar a conocer en casos de éxito empresariales que pueden crecer mucho, que pueden crear mucho empleo y que pueden crear muy buenos empleos pagando buenos salarios, ¿no? Esa es la misión de este programa y por lo que me lo estoy pasando muy bien. ¿Cómo lo ves tú como español, ¿no? Pero con esa experiencia internacional, yo creo que tenemos una seria limitación en los mercados de capitales, tú y yo lo hemos hablado, y cómo lo ves desde fuera, por ejemplo, el Reino Unido o Estados Unidos, ¿no? Que son dos claves ejemplos. Bueno, a lo mejor Estados Unidos se nos va un poco ya, ¿no? Porque es la NBA, pero el Reino Unido, ¿no? O sea, ¿por qué una empresa en el Reino Unido consigue capital y financiación de bonos y de deuda, ¿no? En mejores condiciones, con más cantidad y mejores plazos y menor tipo de interés que una empresa española? Y eso es una desventaja competitiva, ¿no?
Es una gran desventaja competitiva. Yo lo atribuyo a la utilización de la nomenclatura, ¿no? Cuando una empresa sale a bolsa o busca capital entre inversores privados, etcétera, etcétera, en Reino Unido se dice que se hace pública. It's public. Se convierte en pública. Aquí consideramos público lo estatal, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué es lo que pasa? Que aquí hay un normativismo completamente ridículo que intenta proteger a los inversores o a los accionistas, etcétera, de cosas que A, no protege, B, frena. Entonces, claro, resulta que cuando le explicas a la gente en España que el 80% de la economía real en Estados Unidos no se financia vía el canal bancario, dice, ¿y cómo se financia? ¿No? Financiación privada. Financiación privada, acceso a un mercado de capitales abierto, un mercado de capitales potente, en el que no solamente significa eso que la gente piensa que son los mercados y la Citi de gente ahí originando préstamos de billones de dólares, que también, sino el que una empresa, tú te metes ahí en Earl's Court en el metro, en Reino Unido, en Londres, y ves un anuncio de crowdfunding para empresas locales. Ves un anuncio de distintos mecanismos vía fondos para invertir en la economía real de cada región de Reino Unido, etc. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que pasa? Pues que estamos muy lejos porque intentamos reinventar la rueda, ¿no? O sea, sabemos que la rueda ya se ha inventado, vemos cómo funciona en Estados Unidos, vemos cómo funciona en Reino Unido, pero esa falta de, esa especie de miedo hacia el empresario, incluso ese odio hacia el empresario, incluso no, es que hay que tener cuidado, no vaya a ser que. Y resulta que el no vaya a ser que te deja muy lejos de una sociedad en la que efectivamente, pues oye, pues puede haber problemas, pero los problemas se solucionan precisamente dando más apertura, más libertad y mayor capacidad de financiación. Entonces, tenemos un problema. Aquí se intentó algo con el mercado alternativo bursátil y el mercado alternativo de renta fija, pero no funciona por el normativismo. No funciona aquí y no funciona en muchos países de la eurozona y de la Unión Europea, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos un problema con el normativismo y tenemos un problema también con la percepción de cómo se financian las cosas, ¿no? Yo me pasa muchas veces que recibo proyectos de gente que quiere buscar financiación, etcétera, y yo recibo esos proyectos y veo que la gente pierde muchísimo tiempo en colores, en la presentación de PowerPoint, y mucho en bla, bla, bla.
Y hay poca chicha.
Y yo, se enfadaron conmigo una vez, unos porque decía, aquí no veo en ningún sitio que hay para mí, que soy el que te va a prestar el dinero. Y la otra está las expectativas de la gente. La gente muchas veces cuando tiene un proyecto, una startup, etcétera, etcétera, le dices, ¿qué necesidades son? ¿No? Y te dicen, bueno, estamos buscando 1 millón de euros. Ah, hombre, 1 millón de euros. Así. No, hombre, no van a ser 2, medio tampoco. ¿Sabes? Nos falta mucha cultura de emprendimiento que supone, efectivamente, aquí hubo un experimento de intentar traer un programa británico que se llama La Cueva de los Dragones, Dragon's Den, ¿no? En el que hay un grupo de inversores que escuchan a un tío o a una mujer que viene y les cuenta un proyecto y en 20 minutos le dicen si le van a invertir o no van a invertir en él, ¿no? Y aquí se hizo ese experimento de poner ese programa, pero fue un fracaso porque la inmensa mayoría de la gente le echaba la culpa a los que, como malvados, a los que no daban su dinero para aquel que te estaba contando una milonga, ¿no? Entonces, falta mucho, aquí también a fracasar. Fíjate qué curioso, aquí ha fracasado programas de televisión, aquí ha fracasado La Cueva de los Dragones, que es de emprendimiento. Aquí ha fracasado El Aprendiz, The Apprentice. que es en el que la gente va compitiendo para conseguir ser una persona que va a trabajar con Sir Alan Sugar o con Donald Trump en Estados Unidos en su momento. ¿Quién lo iba a decir? Pero es curioso eso, que fracase eso y sin embargo sea el país, uno de los países en los que más éxito ha tenido Gran Hermano y en los que más éxito ha tenido
Eurovisión.
Love Island. ¿Cómo se llama aquí? La Isla de las Tentaciones. Y dices, ¿what? ¿Sabes?
Bueno, oye, es otra cultura.
Es otra cultura, que me parece muy bien.
Sí, pero
lo interesante,
para el desarrollo económico no es tan...
pero no es bueno para el desarrollo económico. ¿Y por qué no es bueno para el desarrollo económico? Porque yo voy por toda España y una de las cosas que me ha pasado en los últimos 12 años, maravillosa, es el darte cuenta que todos esos prejuicios que tienes desde fuera, los empresarios que tenemos, las empresas increíbles que están haciendo cosas innovadoras, rompedoras, unas personas que hacen, vamos, el más tonto hace relojes. Pero todos parece como que hay un punto en el que se quedan y de ahí no
sí, ese es el techo de cristal, ¿no? ¿Por qué no rompemos ahí, no?
Claro.
El tamaño empresarial, ¿no? Que
El
siempre...
tamaño empresarial. O sea, yo veo empresas en las que digo, ¿por qué no es esta persona el siguiente? ¿Puedes? ¿Y por qué no? El siguiente es Jeff Bezos, ¿no? Y hay mucho de prejuicios culturales y normativos y fiscales, porque claro, aquí tenemos el gran escollo fiscal, que es que la inmensa mayoría de las empresas que empiezan, ¿cómo remuneran a sus trabajadores de alta productividad? Con acciones. Entonces aquí te vienen y te meten una fiscalidad al capital que te hunde.
Y te crujen.
Y te crujen. Entonces, tenemos muchas cosas que se podían solucionar muy rápidamente, cambiando un poquito la mentalidad de partir de que alguien es culpable.
Y 3 o 4 cambios normativos no traumáticos.
Es que no son muchos.
Son sencillos. Hombre, estamos cambiando una ley de amnistía sin cambiar la Constitución. O sea, que hacer lo que decimos nosotros debe ser sencillo. Vamos,
muy sencillo.
Tocar 2 o 3 cosas que además tienen un impacto fiscal mínimo, ¿no? En términos de déficit de deuda, ¿no? Que te van a generar PIB y empleo en el futuro, ¿no? Pues
claro,
evidente.
Eso yo creo que España tiene todos los ingredientes en capital humano, en empresas, en localización geográfica, etcétera, etcétera. Todo el mundo lo ve, todo el mundo ve el potencial. Lo que siempre te frustra, y esa es la razón por la que muchas veces te dicen, es que eres un agorero o eres un catastrofista. Y dices, no soy un agorero o un catastrofista. Te estoy diciendo exactamente lo que tú ves. Lo que pasa es que tú te tienes que autoconvencer de que lo que estamos viviendo aquí es lo mejor después del pan de molde. Y no. ¿Sabes? Y tienes que compararte con los mejores. Tienes que compararte con los mejores, ¿no? Y creo que hay muchas cosas que se tienen que cambiar. Mira, por ejemplo, cuando yo empecé a trabajar en Estados Unidos te pagan todo tu dinerito, upfront, ala, ahí tienes tu salario, en bruto, completo, para ti. Y tú pagas los impuestos, tú pagas la sanidad y tú pagas la esta. Y, oh, sorpresa, cuando te das cuenta de la diferencia entre el bruto y el neto, en vez de echarle la culpa al empresario, a lo mejor no. El 90% dice, bueno, el problema está en el otro lado, ¿no?
Yeah.
Entonces yo creo que tenemos que ser más abiertos, nos falta eso. Oye, el cambio, el cambio de la España del año 92, cuando yo salí por primera vez a África y Oriente Medio y que tenía que contratar mercenarios porque te secuestraban no en el aeropuerto o en el hotel, te secuestraban en la puerta del avión, ¿sabes? Etcétera, etcétera. El cambio de la España que empezaba a mirar hacia afuera y que empezaba la internacionalización de las empresas, hoy ha sido espectacular, pero hay que seguir.
Yeah. Bueno, Dani, que nos hemos quedado sin tiempo. Yo me tiraría aquí una hora. Bueno, Daniel y yo hemos discutido mucho. Podríamos discutir de, ¿no? Seguramente cómo hacer el ajuste fiscal, de las pensiones, de los tributos, pero en esto estamos de acuerdo y a lo mejor es una señal, ¿no?
Claro.
Necesitamos empresas más grandes, necesitamos empresas más internacionales, más innovadoras, más productivas y de ahí van a salir los salarios. No van a salir de ningún otro lado. O sea, hay magos por ahí, genios, solo van a salir de aquí y mil gracias por estar en este programa. programa y me ha encantado, ¿no?
Muchas gracias,
Espero
Juan
que le
Carlos.
guste a la gente.
Yo siempre lo digo, que es que desde perspectivas diferentes y con, o sea, lo importante en España, y mira, volvemos a, si me permites, volver al ejemplo de mi padre y mi abuelo. España es un ejemplo en el mundo por los acuerdos
Del consenso.
de consenso. Y mi padre y mi abuelo son un ejemplo de ese consenso, de cómo se pueden llegar a acuerdos con visiones mucho más diferentes que lo que tú y yo podamos estar en desacuerdo. O sea, que hay muchas cosas en las que tenemos que mirar en dónde estamos de acuerdo para tener un plan. Tú siempre hablas de un plan para avanzar en vez de estar constantemente poniéndonos palos en la rueda.
Mi abuelo materno fue juez de paz en el pueblo, un pueblo muy pequeñito en el que no hubo guerra prácticamente con la Falange, y mi otro abuelo estuvo en el frente del Ebro con los republicanos y eran íntimos amigos.
Es que eso era...
Íntimos amigos, o sea, era maravilloso,
Claro.
¿no?
Es que eso era España. Es que eso era España. Es que yo...
Bueno, yo creo que es, la gente está ahí. Lo que pasa es que esta polarización no es más ruido que lo que la sociedad percibe, ¿no?
La polarización solamente existe desde el punto de vista mediático y las redes sociales que lo magnifican todo. Pero cuando te sientas y dices, oye, vamos a ver, tú eres mucho más socialdemócrata, yo soy mucho más liberal, pero en el 80% de las cosas, además discutiendo, discutiendo en las televisiones, es como nos hemos... En el 80% de las cosas se pueden llegar a acuerdos que son buenos para todo el mundo, ojo.
Ese es el punto, ¿no?
Está, claro.
Bueno, nada, pues aquí tenéis a un gran líder y estaremos con otro en el próximo programa. Espero que os guste y que lo veáis mucho y retuitearlo mucho y darlo mucho en las redes. Gracias.
En Arquia Banca nuestros clientes son lo primero. Por eso les ofrecemos soluciones de inversión personalizadas y adaptadas a su perfil de riesgo. Nuestro método: diseñamos una estrategia a largo plazo combinando fondos consolidados y diversificados tras realizar un exhaustivo análisis de los mercados y las tendencias globales. Arquia Banca. Cuidamos de su patrimonio como si fuese nuestro.
Creemos que la sociedad actual necesita más arte y más color. Le da a la gente la oportunidad de asimilar diferentes perspectivas. Es realmente un placer pintar este cuadro, porque es una hermosa imagen para comenzar. Lo último que pintaremos es el auricular en vez del pendiente.
Using a classic and merging it with modern. This is very provoking.
¿Quieres invertir en bolsa? Déjame enseñarte algo. Él es Guille, compra acciones de empresas de videojuegos. Y él es Javier, invierte en acciones del mundo del motor.
¿Pero cuál es la comisión?
Cero comisión.
Abre tu cuenta de cliente totalmente online e invierte en acciones y fondos cotizados sin comisiones hasta 100.000 euros al mes.
Localizarnos ahora es más fácil. La economía a tu alcance. Empresas, inversiones, tecnología. Ya en la APP de Movistar. Vive la economía. Negocios Televisión.
muchos los retos que tiene por delante el sector de la automoción y de los concesionarios. Hablábamos en el día de hoy en el Congreso de Faconauto, por ejemplo, de la digitalización, de la transformación energética, de la transición, de la electrificación, la descarbonización, son solo algunos. Pero aquí en Faconauto estamos hablando con las compañías que están aquí presentes para que nos hablen un poco también ellos de su percepción y de las soluciones que están aportando. Hoy estamos ahora también con Jorge Jurado, que es co-founder y también CMO de Worldwide Mobility. Jorge, muy buenas.
Hola.
Bueno, en primer lugar, ¿qué es esta compañía? ¿A qué os dedicáis? ¿En qué sectores estáis presentes?
Sí, bueno, en Worldwide Mobility, para todos los que no nos conozcáis, somos una empresa tecnológica que desarrollamos tanto hardware como software enfocado en movilidad. ¿Vale? Actualmente lo que aportamos a los concesionarios es que hemos automatizado todo el proceso de alquiler y suscripciones de vehículos y digitalizado para que los gestores de flotas a través de un único back office puedan alquilar o suscribir los vehículos de la forma más fácil, gestionando en todo momento la flota, gestionando la disponibilidad de los vehículos, generando facturas, pagos, etcétera. Y sobre todo a través del hardware, que es algo que le preocupa mucho a los concesionarios, es sobre todo qué va a pasar con sus vehículos, por si en algún momento se los roban o hay impagos. Pues a través del hardware que tenemos nosotros se puede geolocalizar la flota en todo momento, se controla los kilometrajes para ver qué kilómetros le está haciendo el cliente a nuestro vehículo y se puede inmovilizar el vehículo en caso de impago o robo.
Interesante. ¿Qué novedades en este sentido? Porque hemos oído hablar mucho del software, pero me parece también interesante poner el foco en el hardware. ¿Qué novedades estáis presentando en el Congreso?
Pues ya te digo, algo sobre todo novedoso para los concesionarios es la posibilidad de rentabilizar todos los vehículos de ocasión que tengan inmovilizados o que tengan muertos en la campa y sacarles una rentabilidad de manera mucho más rápida a través de lo que es un alquiler o una suscripción.
De cara a los retos del sector y cómo podéis vosotros también aportar soluciones, ¿cuáles destacarías?
Pues las soluciones que podemos destacar sobre todo es ofrecerles una nueva oportunidad a todos los concesionarios con modelos de negocio por explorar y sobre todo modelos de negocio recurrentes. Sabemos que actualmente los que son los modelos de suscripción es un mercado en crecimiento, ¿vale? Es un crecimiento brutal. De hecho, las principales compañías como BCG, Accenture, entre otras, estiman que el mercado de la suscripción de vehículos pues tenga una valoración en torno a los 30-40 mil millones en el año 2030. Entonces, con esto es darles otra oportunidad, otro modelo de negocio a los concesionarios, aparte de lo que es la venta tradicional, con los modelos de negocio de suscripción o de alquiler que después, posteriormente, se pueden convertir en venta de vehículos.
Pues Jorge Jurado, co-founder y CMO de Worldwide Mobility, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Bueno, pues Congreso Faconauto hoy, que se está celebrando en Madrid, en el Palacio Municipal de Congresos de IFEMA, donde nos están explicando todos estos desafíos, todas estas amenazas, pero que se pueden, desde luego, transformar en oportunidades, como nos decían ahora mismo desde esta compañía. Hay muchos retos en el sector de la automoción y en concreto de los concesionarios. Hoy se está hablando de la digitalización, de la transición energética, de los modelos de agencia. Son muchos de ellos que, por cierto, tienen soluciones y se están presentando aquí en el Congreso Faconauto 2024. Estamos hablando con las empresas para que nos cuenten ellos cuáles son sus puntos de vista y las soluciones que podrían estar aportando. Vamos a hablar ahora con Walcu, con el Departamento de Ventas en España, concretamente con Pablo Fernández. Pablo, muy buenas.
¿Qué tal?
Bueno, para el que no conozca la empresa, ¿qué es Walcu?
Bueno, nosotros somos un CRM, al final somos la plataforma más completa ahora mismo que se puede utilizar y tenemos un poco de todo. Los concesionarios pueden gestionar los leads con nosotros, pueden hacer marketing automation, gestión de informes, realmente todo lo que se puede hacer con un cliente se puede hacer a través de Walcu.
¿Qué novedades estáis presentando en este congreso?
Pues principalmente traemos un sistema muy robusto de automatizaciones que ya tendríamos el año pasado, pero este año hemos podido incorporar la parte de la postventa, que es parte muy crucial de la facturación de los concesionarios hoy en día y que esperamos que este año pues, nos traiga muy buenos resultados.
Entiendo que aquí también esa digitalización consideráis que es un reto que se puede solucionar gracias a los proyectos que tiene en marcha Walcu, pero quiero pedirte algo más de énfasis y de detalle en los retos que puede tener el sector por delante y las soluciones que podéis aportar.
Pues como bien dices, la digitalización es el primero. Está claro que tienen que transformar sus concesionarios, tienen que transformar su plantilla. Al final ellos necesitan tener ya ahora mismo un equipo prácticamente de ventas digitales muchas veces dentro de los concesionarios para poder hacer frente a pues, todas las peticiones que vienen a través de los medios digitales y no solo lo que viene a través de la exposición. No solo es tener personas, es también tener personal que esté más preparada para este tipo de casos. Al final hay vendedores que venden muy bien en tienda, pero si tienes que estar persiguiendo por WhatsApp a gente más joven o a través de llamada, pues estos equipos funcionan muy bien. Al final es esa transición digital, no solo llevarla a ahora vendo coches por internet, sino también a tengo la estructura necesaria internamente para poder llevar a cabo esa venta.
Pues Pablo Fernández, ventas en España en Walco, muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti.
Bueno, pues aquí lo están viendo, la digitalización es uno de los claros retos del sector, coinciden en ello muchos de los entrevistados que estamos aquí consultando con ellos en el Congreso de Faconauto 2024 y son muchísimas las soluciones también que se están aportando desde el sector. Digitalización, transformación tecnológica, entre otras cosas, también transición energética, son muchos los retos que tiene por delante el sector de la automoción y especialmente en los concesionarios. Y hoy aquí en Faconauto, en el Congreso de 2024, se está hablando mucho precisamente de esto. Y en Negocios Televisión estamos intentando acceder directamente a las empresas, a su expertise, a sus opiniones sobre lo que está ocurriendo en el mercado ahora mismo de los concesionarios y cómo se pueden solucionar algunos de estos retos que tienen por delante. Estamos ahora con José Antonio Quiroga Gómez, que es CEO de DF Server. José Antonio, muy buenas.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes.
Bueno, ¿qué es DF Server para todo aquel que nos conozca? ¿A qué os dedicáis?
Bueno, deberían conocernos ya mucha gente. Como diría gente de mi edad, somos viejos rockeros ya en esto, unos aventureros que allá por el año 2006-2007 queríamos en eliminar el papel de las oficinas y en este sector hemos comenzado en el 2008 aproximadamente y ahora mismo pues trabajamos o tenemos la fortuna de tener más de 450 ubicaciones físicas de concesionarios, eliminándoles el papel y sustituyendo ese papel por procesos digitales mucho más eficientes. Y además con un valor añadido adicional. Nosotros no solo gestionamos el expediente digital en la parte de ventas o postventa o incluso la parte de automatización de procesos de proveedores, contabilidad, sino que nuestra solución es una solución global que abarca todas las áreas de la concesión. Recursos humanos, marketing, postventa, recambios, ventas, etcétera. Siempre desde el horizonte de optimización de procesos documentales.
José Antonio, ¿qué novedades estáis presentando en este congreso?
Una empresa tecnológica tiene que estar en constante evolución. De hecho, nosotros creemos que la mejor forma de evolucionar es escuchar a nuestros clientes. Aparte de estar en el congreso, todos los años hacemos un evento sectorial donde reunimos a nuestros clientes del sector, más que nada para asegurarnos que caminamos en la dirección correcta. Fruto de ello evolucionamos. ¿Qué presentamos en Faconauto? Pues la parte de optimización documental, reitero, para la gestión de multas de aquellos vehículos en demo, aquellos coches de sustitución que son sancionados y que evidentemente a la concesión le provoca una pérdida de tiempo importante en localizar el vehículo donde estaba, quién se lo había gestión de multas, extensión de garantías, gastos de viaje, la digitalización de la parte de gastos de viaje, porque ya las partes del expediente digital o la parte de proveedores de contabilidad que citaba antes, honestamente lo tenemos implementado ya en toda nuestra cartera de clientes.
La digitalización es en sí un gran reto, ¿no?, para el sector de la automoción y los concesionarios. Quería que nos destacaras algo más concreto dentro de la digitalización como otro de los desafíos que pueden tener por delante los concesionarios y la solución que podríais estar aportando vosotros.
Yo tengo muy claro. Siempre les digo lo mismo a nuestros clientes. Acompañamos en este viaje de transformación digital que no es sencillo y donde el éxito depende única y exclusivamente de ellos. Le acompañamos ese trayecto y le decimos siempre que no se queden con las migajas. El decir, y tengo reseñas grabadas de clientes como un concesionario, puedo ahorrar 1.300 euros al mes en costes de impresión, esos son migajas. Porque esos papeles que antes se imprimían hay que archivarlos, acceder a ellos para consultarlo y creerme, eso no es productivo, como mucho será un mal necesario, pero no es productivo.
Desde luego que sí.
Entonces, ¿hacia dónde hay que ir? A que sean capaces de que eso, ¿cómo le ayudamos? Con un dashboard, con informes sobre la métrica, que permita hacer métricas sobre los procesos efectivamente implementados y que sean capaces de que esos tiempos que ganan, reinventirlos. ¿Dónde? En lo que es el reto que tienen por delante, mejorar la experiencia cliente, pensar que su cliente cada vez es un cliente más digital. Decía el otro día un concesionario, el perfil de consumidor de este sector, el perfil medio es el de 22 a 60 años. Bien, cualquier persona por debajo de los 40 años ahora mismo tiene un perfil digital. Llega a la concesión conociendo un montón de datos del coche. ¿Qué necesita? Mejorar su experiencia cliente, es decir, sentirse valorado, sentirse atendido, sentir que se le asesora. Y ese es el reto que tienen los concesionarios, sustituir procesos improductivos que afortunadamente con nuestra herramienta les permiten ganar tiempo y reinvertirlos mejorando la experiencia cliente.
Pues José Antonio Quiroga Gómez, CEO de DF Server, muchísimas gracias, muy interesante.
Nosotros, como siempre, un placer.
Bueno, pues como ven, ya no es solo pues, esos procesos de digitalización o, por ejemplo, esa transición energética que decíamos antes, lo que es un reto para el sector, sino también esa relación con el cliente e intentar maximizar el bienestar del cliente también utilizando la vía de la digitalización. Hoy en Faconauto, en el Congreso 2024, es este y muchos otros retos los que se están presentando con sus también correspondientes soluciones.
Ven al Torreón, estamos en El Pardo, un espacio único en plena naturaleza. Disfruta de momentos de desconexión mientras saboreas la mejor gastronomía. Disponemos de 7 amplias terrazas y salones para todo tipo de eventos. Degusta nuestros exquisitos platos acompañados de una selecta bodega de vinos. A tu servicio, un gran parking y zona infantil. Abierto los 365 días del año. Cocina ininterrumpida desde las 10 de la mañana hasta las 12 de la noche. Haz tu reserva.
Localizarnos ahora es más fácil. La economía a tu alcance. Empresas, inversiones, tecnología. Ya en la APP de Movistar. Vive la economía. Negocios Televisión.
Nos acompaña Rosa Duce, Chief Investment Officer de Deutsche Bank en España. Bienvenida, buenos días.
Buenos días.
Bueno, ¿cómo veis la fotografía del mercado? ¿Cómo veis este entorno de codicia, ¿no? Que tiene ahora mismo al inversor, que no le cabe?
Hombre, de codicia, pero es verdad que el mercado ha subido mucho y muy deprisa y sí que hay una percepción de que si ya a estos niveles, ¿no?, os merece la pena entrar o puede corregir, ¿no? Yo creo que la subida ha sido sana. La subida de final de año quizá fue muy exagerada, pensando que los tipos iban a bajar mucho, pero en estos primeros 2 meses del año realmente las subidas se han basado en beneficios. Yo creo que efectivamente puede haber un pequeño recorte, pero no estamos esperando un recorte brusco del mercado porque yo creo que los fundamentales son sólidos. Tenemos inflación a la baja, tipos que van a bajar y un crecimiento que de momento la recesión no se ve. Entonces, bueno, eso es un entorno favorable para el mercado.
¿Qué calendario barajáis en este entorno? Powell habla hoy, habla también mañana. Congreso y Senado, vemos también mañana a Christine Lagarde, pero en Estados Unidos, ¿qué calendario veis en un entorno en el que parece que la economía sigue fuerte, el empleo sigue fuerte y que no hay tampoco razón para una bajada de tipos apresurada, ¿no?
No, lo cierto es que lo que no hay es prisa por bajar los tipos. Yo creo que los bancos centrales llevan ya mucho tiempo diciendo que van a bajar los tipos, pero desde luego ni tan rápido ni tan tanto como se está descontando en el mercado. Y el mercado se ha ajustado, porque a final de año se esperaba que bajaran hasta 150 puntos, ¿no? Y de hecho ahora estamos entre 75, 100. Nosotros de hecho siempre hemos pensado que pueden bajar 75 puntos porque más no es necesario, como tú bien dices. No hace falta.
En ese entorno, ¿pensáis que puede ser lineal el movimiento de bajada? ¿Que puede tener paradas? ¿Cómo veis el movimiento de bajada que puede hacer la Fed y en qué tiempos?
Claro, yo creo que lo comentabas antes, ¿no? Vamos a ver qué dice Powell estos otros días, vamos a ver qué dice Lagarde también en la reunión del Banco Central Europeo. Los bancos centrales lo que están viendo es que la economía se está sosteniendo mejor de lo esperado, sobre todo en Estados Unidos, porque en Europa la realidad es que la economía está muy débil, ¿no? Pero van a ser muy cautos a la hora de bajar, porque la inflación general es verdad que se está comportando bien, pero la subyacente sigue estando a niveles altos y además los datos que hemos visto de preliminares de febrero de inflación en Europa es verdad que son cifras más bajas, pero menos de lo esperado. Por tanto, van a ser cautelosos. Yo creo que probablemente empiecen a bajar como en mayo, junio, no antes. Es probable que bajen y esperen a ver cómo evoluciona el mercado y cómo evoluciona la inflación y cómo evoluciona el crecimiento y luego sigan bajando. O sea, que bajen antes del verano, después del verano y a lo mejor a final de año. Y luego, efectivamente, en 2025 pueden seguir bajando, pero siempre con mucha cautela.
¿Burbuja tecnológica?
No, yo creo que burbuja tecnológica no. Yo creo que lo que sí que es verdad que estos magníficos 7 no han subido mucho y muy deprisa y tienen la sensación de que si realmente a estos precios las valoraciones son demasiado exigentes. La realidad es que estas empresas es lógico que coticen con cierta prima porque los beneficios nos han demostrado que son empresas que tienen mucho crecimiento por delante y que tienen un potencial enorme. Es verdad que los niveles son muy altos y que por eso decía al principio que podría haber una pequeña corrección. Pero en términos de valoración tampoco están tan caras, están todavía por debajo de los niveles de 2021, porque es verdad que han subido los precios, pero también han subido mucho los beneficios. Por tanto, a nosotros en Estados Unidos todavía nos sigue gustando más ese segmento del mercado, el de las grandes empresas.
¿Cómo veis Europa y si entendéis que una parte del inversor mire a Estados Unidos en lugar de Europa en un entorno como el actual, de crecimiento de las dos economías y de riesgos?
A ver, así como en Estados Unidos estamos más en un nivel más grandes valores y tecnológico, bueno, todo lo que tiene que ver con tecnológico, porque como sabe ya no están en el sector tecnología, sino que están repartidas en consumo cívico, servicios de comunicación. En Europa vemos más valor en lo que son empresas cíclicas. ¿Por qué? Pues porque el escenario que se ha descontado sí que es un escenario demasiado negativo y nuestra previsión es que la economía europea a partir de la última parte del año empieza otra vez un poco a levantar cabeza, un poco ayudada por esa recuperación que esperamos de China y también por las rebajas de tipos. En ese sentido, por tanto, en Europa nos gusta más el consumo cíclico.